before the first human being ever set foot on Arrakis, something was already ancient there. Not ancient in the way that mountains are ancient, or that oceans are ancient. Not the passivity of geological time, stone sitting in stone, water resting in water. Ancient in the way of something that had been alive continuously for longer than most of the inhabited universe had been looking. Something that moved. Something that fed. Something that had been shaping the planet beneath it and the sky above it for millions of years before any consciousness capable of wonder had arrived to wonder at it. The sandworm of Arrakis was not a creature that fit easily into the categories that human beings developed for thinking about life. It was too large to be comprehended at human scale. The specimens that the Fremen rode in the Desert War were 100 meters or more in length, and these were not the largest the desert contained. It was too long-lived to be placed on the timeline that most organisms occupied. The most ancient of the worms had been living continuously for centuries, a single biological individual, not a succession of generations, but one creature enduring through time. And it was too consequential to be understood as simply another member of the planet's ecology, because the planet's ecology was, in a fundamental and literal sense, the sandworm's creation. Not metaphorically. Not in the loose sense in which we say that trees create the forest, in the precise sense that without the sandworm and the biological cycle it anchored, Arrakis would have been a different kind of desert entirely, drier, simpler, less chemically complex, and without the one substance that made it the most important planet in the known universe. The sandworm made the spice. This sentence sits at the center of everything. Not simply at the center of the sandworm's story, which is what we are tracing here, but at the center of the entire 10,000-year span of the Padishah Imperium, at the center of the Guild's navigational monopoly, at the center of the Bene Gesserit's breeding programs, at the center of every war that had been fought over Arrakis, and every political arrangement that had been built on the assumption that the spice would continue to flow. The sandworm made the spice, and the spice made the Imperium, and the Imperium organized the lives of billions of human beings across hundreds of worlds, and all of that, every bit of it, rested on the biology of a creature that most of the people whose lives it shaped had never seen, could not have named, and would have found impossible to imagine. To understand the sandworm is to understand what Arrakis actually was beneath its political surface, beneath the house insignia and the spice contracts and the military deployments and the administrative reports. To understand the sandworm is to understand the planet as a living system, old, coherent, and operating according to its own logic that the human beings who arrived to exploit it consistently underestimated. This is the complete history of the sandworm. It begins, as it must, with the desert itself. Arrakis was not always a desert. This is the first fact that resists ordinary comprehension, because the Arrakis of recorded human history was so completely a desert. So thoroughly and totally committed to aridity, to the absence of surface water, to the specific hostile chemistry of a world without rain, that it is difficult to imagine it as anything else. The desert was not a condition Arrakis had fallen into. It was what Arrakis was, at the molecular level, at the geological level, at the level of the atmospheric chemistry. The desert was Arrakis. And yet the geological record whispered otherwise. Lyot Kynes, the imperial planetologist who had spent his life understanding Arrakis the way few people had ever understood any world, read in the rock the evidence of what the planet had once contained. Not ocean, not the kind of abundance that water-rich worlds took for granted, but moisture. Atmospheric moisture. Subsurface water, locked in geological formations at depths that the desert's sand trout had sealed away from the surface over what the evidence suggested were millions of years of sustained ecological engineering. The sand trout were the beginning of the story, not the end, not the climax, not even the most dramatic element, but the beginning, the foundation, the biological mechanism that made everything else possible and that explained why Arrakis was what it was rather than what the geology suggested it might otherwise have been. The sand trout were small. This is the first surprising thing about them, given what they would eventually become. They were leathery, flat, roughly the size of a human hand in their juvenile form, creatures that resembled nothing so much as a very thick leaf made of something that was not quite skin but served some of the same functions. They moved through the sand in vast numbers, feeding on the microbial organisms that lived in the substrate, reproducing slowly by division, maintaining their extraordinary numbers through the sheer reproductive persistence of creatures that had been refining their biology for millions of years. Their primary ecological function was the sealing of moisture. The sand trout had evolved over the incomprehensible span of Arrakis's biological history into effective semi-permeable membranes capable of enclosing and storing water. They moved through the sand, and when they encountered moisture, subsurface water, atmospheric condensation, the biological water content of any organism unlucky enough to be caught in their aggregate, they sealed it, absorbed it into their collective structure, held it against the desert's appetite. The mechanism was not simple at the molecular level, but its effect was clear. The sand trout was systematically removing water from Arrakis's accessible geology and atmosphere, locking it in what the scientific literature would eventually call an excluded zone, a region of the deep substrate where water existed but was biologically unavailable. The sand trout maintained this zone with the relentless efficiency of an organism that had been selected for exactly this function across evolutionary timescales. Why? Evolution does not have purposes in the human sense, but it has outcomes, and the outcome of what the sand trout were doing. The reason they had been selected for this capability rather than some other was the creation of the ecological conditions that allowed the sandworm to exist. Sandworms required extreme aridity. The chemistry of the pre-spice mass, the biological precursor to melange that formed when certain conditions were met in the substrate, was only possible in the near-total absence of surface water. The sandworm's biology, which was tied to that chemistry in ways that the ecologists who studied Arrakis spent years working out, was optimized for a desert so dry that the word desert understated the aridity. The sandworms and the sand trout had co-evolved over millions of years into a closed ecological system. The sand trout created the desert conditions that the sandworm required, and the sandworm, in its life cycle, produced the biological conditions for a new generation of sand trout. The two were not separate organisms in any meaningful ecological sense. They were two stages of the same biological cycle. This cycle, what Pardot Kynes and then his son, Liet Kynes, would eventually map in detail, what the Fremen had been living alongside for millennia without fully understanding the mechanism, what the Imperium would never adequately appreciate before it was almost too late, was the foundational biological reality of Arrakis. Everything else, the spice most particularly, was a product of this cycle. The pre-spice mass formed when conditions in the sand substrate were right, adequate temperature, adequate depth. The specific mineral chemistry that the sandworm's biological history had deposited across the substrate over millions of years. The mass was biological, not geological, It was the metabolic product of the sandworm's digestive process, excreted into the substrate in forms that accumulated over time. The specific compounds that constituted this early-stage spice were extraordinarily chemically active, capable of interacting with a range of biological systems in ways that the imperial chemists had been studying since the Arrakis colony was established without fully mapping the interaction pathways. When the pre-spice mass reached sufficient concentration and temperature, it erupted. The spice blow, the visible event on the desert surface, the orange-red plume that rose from the sand and drifted on the wind, the event that spice harvesting operations monitored for constantly and responded to with frantic urgency, was the moment at which the pre-spice mass was forced to the surface by the pressures of the eruption. It was the most accessible form of the spice cycle to outside observers, dramatic, visible, economically significant, and brief enough to be processed before the worms arrived. And the worms always arrived. This was not coincidence. The worm's sensory system was attuned to the chemical signature of the spice blow in the same way that a predator was attuned to the chemical signature of prey. The blow represented melange in concentrated, accessible form, and the worm's metabolism required melange in ways that the biologists had not fully worked out. Whether the worm consumed the spice at the blow site as part of a metabolic cycle, whether it was responding to the blow as a territorial signal, whether the relationship between the worm and the surface spice was more complex than either. Of those explanations captured, these were questions that the scientific literature debated without resolution. What was not debated was the outcome. Worms came to spice blows, arrived from considerable distances, arrived with a speed and directness that suggested something more than coincidence. The spice harvesting crews of Arrakis knew this the way they knew everything essential about the desert, through the specific experience of having the knowledge of it be a matter of survival. The carriel crews who monitored the crawler operations, the ground crews who watched for worm sign while the harvesters worked, the crawler operators who had to balance the speed of extraction against the certainty that time was running out. All of them were participants in a race between economic extraction and the biological fact of the worm's arrival. The worm would always win if given enough time. The only question was whether the crew had gotten enough spice out before the time ran out. The worm that arrived at a spice blow was not the worm at its most spectacular. The worms that moved through the deep desert, the makers that the Fremen called down and rode, were often far larger. Creatures whose scale made the desert itself feel small, whose movement through the substrate sent surface tremors that could be detected from kilometers away, whose emergence from the sand was an event of such physical scale that observers consistently reached for religious vocabulary to describe it because the natural vocabulary of scale and biology felt insufficient. The largest worms were the oldest worms, and the oldest worms were old in a sense that the word old did not quite capture when applied to human beings. Individual worms had been alive, continuously alive as single organisms for centuries, not generations, not the kind of continuity that comes from genetic inheritance and the propagation of characteristics from parent to offspring. A single biological individual eating and moving and growing and existing for hundreds of years. This longevity was one of the things that made the sandworm difficult to fit into the categories that ecological science had developed for thinking about organisms. Most biological systems operated on the time scale of generations, of the rise and fall of individual members of a population. The oldest sandworms had outlasted the fall of dynasties. They had been alive when the Harkonnen occupation of Arrakis began and would, absent interference, still have been alive centuries later. They were the kind of organism that made geological time feel personal rather than abstract. The relationship between the sandworm and the spice was not simply the relationship between a creature and its ecological product. It was more specific and more intimate than that. The spice was melange. The word itself, an ancient term for a mixture, a blend, captured something true about what the compound was. Not a single chemical, but a complex of related compounds produced by the worm's biological processes and modified by the chemistry of the desert substrate and the atmosphere. The full chemical characterization of melange was not simple, and the imperial chemists who worked on it were consistently surprised by the compound's complexity. New interaction pathways were still being described well into the Atreides period, and the full map of melange's biological effects on human physiology remained incomplete throughout the saga's timeframe. What was known, melange extended life. This was not a subtle effect detectable only through careful statistical analysis. It was dramatic, measurable, and consistent enough that it had been the foundational assumption of imperium-level politics for thousands of years. People who consumed melange regularly lived substantially longer than people who did not. The mechanism was not fully understood, but involved, at minimum, the spice's effects on cellular repair processes, on the specific biological pathways associated with aging, on the maintenance of the specific biochemical equilibria that distinguished living tissue from non-living chemistry. The guild navigators, who consumed spice in enormous quantities, whose entire bodies had been reshaped by decades of immersion in concentrated melange, were living evidence of how complete that transformation could be. The spice also altered consciousness. This effect was the one that interested the Bene Gesserit most directly, that drove the Fremen's specific religious relationship with the desert, that made the guild navigators possible, and that would eventually produce in Paul Atreides something that had never existed before in quite the same form. The consciousness alteration was not simply intoxication in the ordinary sense, not the temporary disruption of normal consciousness that recreational compounds produced with a return to baseline when the compound cleared the system. It was, at sustained exposure levels, a permanent restructuring of perceptual and cognitive processes. The blue within blue eyes of the Fremen, the total saturation of the iris by the spice pigment, visible evidence of years of deep melange exposure, were the physical marker of a neurological and perceptual transformation that went far deeper than the visible surface. The spice allowed, or in some individuals, at sufficient exposure unlocked, capacities for prescience, for expanded pattern recognition, for the specific kind of probability navigation that the guild navigators used to fold space without a physical destination being calculable in ordinary mathematical terms. This capacity was not widely distributed in the population. It required both the genetic foundation that made a person's nervous system capable of the transformation and the sustained spice exposure that triggered the transformation in those who were capable of it. But in those individuals, the navigators, the Reverend Mothers, the rare prescient individuals that the Bene Gesserit breeding program was working toward, the consciousness alteration was genuine and extraordinary. All of this came from the sandworm's biology, not incidentally, not as a side product of something else the worm was doing. The spice was the worm's metabolic contribution to its ecosystem, and the ecosystem happened to include, after several million years of biological isolation on Arrakis, a small number of human beings who had been living in it long enough to adapt to the spice's presence in their bodies. The Fremen had been saturated with melange since the first generation that arrived on Arrakis, since before that, in some sense, since the specific compounds that melange was related to existed in the soil and water and air of Arrakis in low concentrations everywhere, not only in the concentrated form of the spice blow. The Fremen who were born in the Sciaches were born already beginning the saturation process. By adulthood, after years of eating and drinking and breathing in an environment suffused with low-level melange, the physical evidence was in their eyes, that blue deeper than any natural iris colour, the spice pigment showing through the whites, the specific visual signature of a human body that had been chemically transformed by years of living inside the sandworm's ecological production. The Fremen had a name for the sandworm that was also a theology, Shai Hulud. The term resisted clean translation, the deepest roots of Fremen linguistic history compressed into a single compound that meant something like the old man of the desert, or the ancient one, or simply the antiquity, the thing that was old in a way that dwarfed human reckoning of age. The Hulud element meant eternal or enduring. Shai meant something in the range of grandfather or deep ancestor or the one who was before. Put together, the compound pointed at something that human language had not built categories for. A creature so old, so present, so constitutive of the world it inhabited that speaking of it required the vocabulary the Fremen used for the divine. Because in the Fremen framework, the sandworm was divine. Not metaphorically, not in the soft sense in which some religious traditions described nature as sacred. The sandworm was literally the deity of the desert, the actual physical entity around which the Fremen's religious understanding was organized, the thing they prayed to, the thing they feared and revered, and whose continued existence was as fundamental to their world as the existence of the sky. This is not as strange as it might seem to people from traditions that located the divine in the invisible or the abstract. The Fremen lived in a world dominated by the sandworm in the most literal sense. The sand was full of them, at depths you could not see. The desert surface was shaped by them, the dunes configured by the transit of their enormous bodies through the substrate. The chemical environment you breathed and ate was the product of their biology. To say that Shai Hulud was the god of the desert was, in the Fremen framework, to say something barely distinguishable from the sun is hot or the sand is dry. It was simply what was true. The divine and the ecological had merged into the same fact. The crysknife, the most sacred object in Fremen culture, the blade that every adult Fremen carried and that was given and received with the weight of the most serious religious ritual, was made from a sandworm's tooth. Not symbolically made to resemble a sandworm's tooth, made from an actual tooth, extracted from a dead worm, crystallized through a specific chemical process that the Fremen had developed over generations, shaped and polished into a blade. The crysknife was what it was, the god's own body, carried at the side of every Fremen as a weapon and a talisman and a reminder that the desert and its maker were not separate things. The obligation associated with the crysknife, that a drawn blade could not be sheathed without drawing blood, was religious law with roots in the ecology. The worm's tooth was potent, crystallized into a material with specific properties that included a certain instability outside the electromagnetic field of a living Fremen body. The religious law encoded this practical reality into sacred obligation. You drew the blade because you were committed to something, and the blood was the completion of that commitment. The ecology and the theology were, as in so many aspects of Fremen life, the same thing. The worm-riding tradition deserves its own careful examination, because it illuminates more completely than almost anything else what the Fremen relationship with Shai Hulud actually was. Worm-riding was not a sport. It was not a military tactic, at least not originally. It was not primarily a transportation solution, though it functioned as one. It was the most complete expression available to a Fremen adult of their relationship with the sacred, the moment at which a human being literally climbed onto the back of the god and directed it, using the tools the tradition had developed for exactly this purpose across the desert that was the god's domain. The tools were the maker hooks, curved implements designed to be inserted under the leading edge of the worm's scales and levered to prevent the scale from lying flat against the body. The worm's skin was segmented into ring sections, and each ring could be held open by the applied pressure of a hook, which exposed the softer tissue beneath to the desert air. The desert air on Arrakis was oxidizing in ways that the worm's sensitive tissues found uncomfortable. The worm responded to this discomfort by rotating its body to expose a different segment to the air, which was exactly what the rider wanted, since directing the rotation controlled the direction of travel. This mechanism, the hook under the scale, the rotation response, the rider directing the direction of rotation to steer, was understood by the Fremen as a negotiation rather than a domination. You were not breaking the worm. You were not defeating it. You were in a specific kind of communication with it, using the worm's own responses to guide it rather than overpowering its will. The distinction mattered to the Fremen in ways that were simultaneously practical and religious. Practical because the worm could not in fact be overpowered by any human strength, and a rider who tried to operate on that basis would die. Religious because the god was not an object to be controlled, but a presence to be engaged with on the god's own terms. The Fremen rite of passage was the first worm ride, the moment at which a young adult Fremen demonstrated that they could call a worm, mount it, and direct it, sustaining the ride long enough to demonstrate genuine capability rather than lucky survival. The calling itself was a skill, the thumper, the device that generated vibrations in the substrate that drew worms from depth. Had to be planted correctly, set to the right rhythm, positioned in terrain where the worm's approach could be managed. Reading the sand sign of the approaching worm, the way the surface shifted as enormous weight moved through the substrate below, was a skill that took years to develop to the level of reliability. Knowing when to run and when to position, understanding the worm's speed and the time available between the first sign and the moment of emergence, these were the accumulated knowledge of generations of Fremen who had been developing this understanding under the most rigorous possible testing conditions. First rides were sometimes fatal. This was known and accepted. The desert did not protect the young from the consequences of inadequate preparation, and the worm did not moderate its behavior for those still learning. What the tradition provided was the accumulated knowledge, passed from experienced rider to student, from naib to young community member, from the stories of famous rides to the absorbed understanding of what the desert demanded. That made survival possible for those who had truly prepared and who approached the first ride with genuine capability rather than performance of capability. Paul Atreides' first worm ride was significant in ways beyond the personal. He had been on Arrakis for weeks, learning the sand walk and the water discipline and the basic survival knowledge the Fremen transmitted to anyone who was going to exist in the deep desert. He had been observing, absorbing, developing the particular attentiveness that desert survival demanded. And then he rode. He rode with the Fremen watching, not to evaluate him, or not only to evaluate him, but because a first worm ride was a communal event, because the community's relationship with the god was being enacted through this individual's first engagement with it, because what happened on that ride would be part of the story of the Sietch's relationship with the Lisan al-Gaib, the figure that the Missionaria Protectiva had prepared them to recognize. His survival was expected by the time it happened because the Fremen had been watching him for long enough to know he was capable. But the watching was necessary, and the watching was sacred. He rode for a significant distance. He demonstrated the control that the hook technique allowed. He dismounted cleanly, which required the same presence and judgment as the mounting. The moment of dismount was the moment of maximum exposure, when the rider had to judge exactly the right configuration and act on that judgment in the brief window available. He did it correctly, and the desert received him, and the community understood that their assessment had been correct. The God Emperor Leto II would ride worms as a child in Children of Dune in circumstances that made even the Fremen riders around him uncertain of what they were watching. But his relationship with the worm would eventually become something qualitatively different from what any Fremen rider had ever had. Something that collapsed the distinction between rider and ridden, between human being and maker, between the person who called the god and the god itself. That would come later. For now, in the time of Paul's training in the desert, the worm was what it had always been. The ancient thing, the god, the source of everything, carrying human beings across its own domain on terms that it could have declined at any moment, and that the riders understood as a gift rather than a conquest. The ecology of the sandworm and the spice had been described before Paul arrived on Arrakis. There were field reports, xenobiological surveys, the accounts of spice hunters and traders, and the occasional scientific expedition that had looked at the planet with genuine curiosity rather than simply as a resource to be assessed and extracted. But the understanding was fragmentary, shaped by the specific limitations of outside observers who had not lived in the desert long enough to understand it from within. Paul Atreides changed this. Not immediately, not through the specific acts of scientific investigation that his imperial appointment might have suggested, but through the more fundamental act of becoming part of what he was studying. He arrived on Arrakis as an ecological expert with a mandate to understand the spice ecology and a personal inclination to actually understand it rather than to produce the kind of pro forma reports that the imperial administrative apparatus preferred. He encountered the Fremen in circumstances that opened a genuine relationship rather than the exploitative arrangement that characterized most official to Fremen interactions of the period. And he became, over years of genuine engagement with both the planet and its people, something that the official reports would have struggled to categorize. A scientist who was also a Fremen, who understood the desert from inside it. Kynes developed the theory of the sandworm life cycle over years of patient observation and the kind of intelligence gathering that only comes from relationships with people who know what you're looking at. The Fremen knew the worm. They had been living with it, worshipping it, riding it, harvesting its teeth, and using its excretions for generations before any imperial scientist arrived. What they lacked was the theoretical framework that could connect their practical knowledge into a coherent picture of the whole system. Kynes provided the framework. The Fremen provided the knowledge. The result was an understanding of the Arrakis ecology that no outside observer had achieved and that no inside observer had been equipped to articulate. The key insight was the completeness of the cycle. The sand trout sealed water and created desert conditions. Desert conditions allowed the worm to exist. The worm's biology, its digestive processes, its excretions, its movement through the substrate, created the specific chemical conditions that produced the pre-spice mass. The pre-spice mass matured and erupted as the spice blow. The spice blow was the metabolic gift of the worm to the ecosystem. And the ecosystem, the Fremen, the birds and animals of Arrakis, the entire biological community that had co-evolved with the worm over millions of years, was dependent on that metabolic gift in ways that made it impossible to imagine the ecosystem without the worm at its center. This was not simply a useful scientific model. It was the foundation of Kynes' other great project, the one that would outlast his scientific career and his life, the one that his son Liet would continue and that Paul Atreides would eventually accelerate in ways that Pardot Kynes had not imagined possible. The terraforming program. The project of making Arrakis something other than a desert, not by fighting the desert, not by imposing water-world conditions on a world that was not suited for them, but by using the understanding of the desert's own ecology to introduce changes that would, over centuries, produce a marginal zone at the poles and in sheltered areas where precipitation could accumulate and plant life could establish itself. The key understanding that made the terraforming project coherent was this: the Sandworms' ecology was not the entire planet, it was the deep desert. The areas where the worm could not reach, the sheltered zones, the rocky outcroppings, the polar regions where temperature differentials created their own microclimates, these were zones where the sand trout's water sealing function was less complete. Where a different ecology might coexist with the worms without threatening it. The vision was not of a planet without sandworms, it was of a planet with sandworms and something else, a marginal zone of moisture and vegetation at the edges of the worm's domain, leaving the great sand sea for Shai Hulud, while giving the Fremen something more than the desert's bare survival arithmetic. The Fremen heard this vision and recognized it as sacred. It was what they had been waiting for, not a scientist's report, but a prophet's promise, delivered in the specific language of ecological possibility that their tradition had been preparing them to receive. The ecological transformation became the dream, the project, the multi-generational commitment that gave the Science communities their long-range purpose, and that would eventually, in the Children of Dune period, create its own crisis when the dream succeeded faster than expected, and began to compete with the ecology that had given rise to it. To understand how the sandworm was perceived by the Imperium as a whole, not by the Fremen, who understood it from within, and not by the careful scientists who had devoted themselves to understanding it, but by the political and economic and military actors who were the real drivers of Arrakis' history. It is necessary to understand what the spice represented at the civilizational scale and what the worm meant as the source of that spice. The Guild Navigators were the most visible and dramatic evidence of what the spice did to human beings at very high exposure levels. The Navigators were human beings, or had been human beings, before decades of immersion in concentrated melange had transformed them into something for which human being was an accurate biological category, but an increasingly inadequate descriptive one. Their bodies had been reshaped by the spice, the eyes changed to a pure, saturated blue with no white remaining, the skin acquiring translucency, the body in some cases physically altered in ways that made ordinary gravity difficult to manage without the specific equipment of the navigator's tank. But the physical transformation was almost beside the point. What the spice had done to their minds, to the specific cognitive and perceptual faculties that made them capable of doing what they did, was the thing that made them essential rather than simply remarkable. Guild navigators could fold space. They could navigate a ship from one point in the known universe to another without physically traversing the distance between, using the prescient capabilities that the spice unlocked in those genetically predisposed to it to calculate the safe path through fold space. The calculation was not mathematical in any ordinary sense. It was the specific form of prescience, the seeing of probable futures with sufficient clarity to identify the path that led to safe arrival rather than the path that led to disaster, that required both the right genetics and the right saturation. Without the navigators, interstellar travel was possible but dangerously unreliable. With the navigators, it was as reliable as any form of long-distance travel could be made in a universe where space was vast and hazards were real. The Guild's navigational monopoly was not artificial. It was not the result of political maneuvering or military conquest alone. It was the product of the specific biological fact that the navigators could do something that nothing else could do, and that something was essential to the functioning of interstellar civilization. All of it depended on the spice. All of it depended, therefore, on the sandworm. The Emperor needed it. The Guild needed it. The Bene Gesserit needed it for their spice agony, the ordeal through which a Reverend Mother was created, the transformation of the water of life from a lethal substance into something that opened the ancestral memory, that required the spice in its most concentrated liquid form, and that the sisterhood maintained as one of their most closely held practices. The noble houses needed it for the longevity it provided to those wealthy enough to consume it regularly. The medical establishment needed it for the specific therapeutic applications that had been developed over millennia. The millions of ordinary people across hundreds of worlds who had spent years consuming melange needed it in the specific way of addiction. Because extended spice use created a dependency at the cellular level that could not be broken without severe consequences. The sandworm was therefore, without being aware of it, the most politically significant organism in the known universe. Every diplomatic relationship, every military alliance, every economic arrangement that operated above a certain scale was ultimately downstream of the sandworm's continued existence and the continued production of the spice that was the sandworm's metabolic gift to its ecosystem. The Harkonnens understood this at the level that motivated their 80-year occupation of Arrakis. They needed to control the spice, not because they cared about the sandworm or the desert, but because controlling the spice meant controlling everything that was built on the assumption that the spice would continue to be available. The Atreides understood it at the level that made the transfer of Arrakis from Harkonnen to Atreides' administration both the great opportunity and the great threat of Leto Atreides' political career. The Emperor understood it at the level that motivated his decision to allow and possibly to encourage the conspiracy that destroyed House Atreides. Because a single house that became too dominant in spice production was a house that was potentially more powerful than the Emperor himself. None of these political actors were primarily thinking about the sandworm. They were thinking about the spice, and the spice was abstracted in their minds from the biology that produced it. The sandworm was the machine, the factory, the geological feature that happened to produce the economically essential compound. The idea that the machine had its own history, its own internal logic, its own ecological relationships and vulnerabilities was not central to the political calculations of the Imperium's actors. It would eventually become so, but only after the machine's vulnerability became impossible to ignore. The sandworm was not invulnerable. This matters because the politics of the Imperium sometimes seem to assume that it was, that the spice would flow forever, that the desert would endure, that Shai Hulud was eternal in the way that the Fremen's theology suggested. The ecology was stable over the timescales that human political planning operated on. But ecology, even very stable ecology, has its vulnerabilities, and the sandworm's vulnerabilities were specific and consequential. Water killed sandworms, not gradually, not through some slow erosive process, directly completely through a biological incompatibility that the worm's anatomy had never developed a defense against. Contact with water, the substance that the sand trout had been removing from the desert for millions of years, the substance that the worm's biology was utterly unequipped to manage, caused a sandworm's ring sections to rupture. The mechanism was biochemical, rooted in what water did when it reached tissues that had evolved in total aridity, and it was absolute. A sandworm that encountered water did not slowly decline. It dissolved. The largest worms were most at risk from flooding, which was why the spice operations were located in the deep desert rather than near any of the marginal atmospheric collection areas. The worms avoided zones where atmospheric condensation could produce puddles on the surface, responded to the chemical signals that indicated the presence of water before they emerged, modified their routes through the substrate to stay within the ecological zone that the sand trout had maintained for them. The relationship between the sand trout and the sandworm in this respect was not simply that the sand trout created desert conditions, but that the sand trout maintained a buffer between the worm's biology and the substance that would kill it. The sand trout were, among other things, the worm's environmental safety system. This vulnerability was known, but not operationally significant under normal Arrakis conditions. Water existed on Arrakis, but not at the surface in quantities large enough to threaten the worms. The sand trout were too effective and too widespread for surface water to accumulate under normal conditions. The vulnerability was theoretical, a biological footnote, not a practical concern, until the terraforming project began to make it a practical concern. And until, far in the future, a human being decided to make the biological incompatibility between the sandworm and water a feature of a deliberate planetary transformation. Not a problem to be solved, but a mechanism to be exploited. The sand trout were the other half of the vulnerability equation. The sand trout could be separated from the sandworm. They were small, individually manageable, capable of being picked up and handled by human hands in ways that the sandworm was not. And the sand trout had a specific property documented in the ecological literature and known to the Fremen as a practical reality. That would eventually become the most consequential single fact about the sandworm life cycle. The sand trout could cover a human body. This had happened to Fremen in the stories and the tradition, desert stories of people who had been caught in areas where sand trout were aggregating in unusual numbers, who had been briefly covered by the creatures before managing to remove them. The experience was described as deeply unpleasant, not dangerous in the short term for someone with the knowledge and presence of mind to respond correctly, but something that the Fremen approach with caution and respect. The sand trout's water sealing function applied to any water-containing surface it encountered, including the water-containing surface of a human body. Leto II would turn this property into something no one had anticipated. There is a moment in the history of the sandworm that requires slowing down, because it is the moment at which everything that was true about the worm's history becomes the foundation for something new. Something that the ecology had not contained before, that the Fremen theology had not described, that the Bene Gesserit breeding program had not been aiming at. Leto II Atreides was 9 years old when he went into the desert and allowed the sand trout to cover him. The specific age matters less than the specific act. He was pre-born, carrying from before his own birth the full weight of other memory, the accumulated consciousness of his female and male ancestors available to him in a way that adults who underwent the formal ordeal of the spice agony achieved only partially. He was prescient, with a faculty that exceeded his father Paul's, in depth, if not yet in clarity. That showed him the probability space of the future with a specificity that no previous consciousness had possessed, And he had looked at that probability space and seen what it contained, what every path available to the human species led to, what the only way through looked like. The sand trout that covered his body began to do what sand trout did. They sealed the moisture. His skin became something other than human skin. Not immediately, not in a single transformative moment. Over days, over weeks, over the months and years that followed, the sand trout integration proceeded. His body became a collaboration, human tissue and sand trout tissue, in a relationship that was neither fully one thing nor the other. That operated at the cellular level in ways that neither human biology alone nor sand trout biology alone would have produced. The transformation was physical in the most literal sense. His skin became impermeable in ways that human skin was not. His muscles became capable of outputs that human muscles could not achieve. His nervous system, through whatever mechanism the sand trout integration operated on it, became capable of outputs that human neurology could not have produced. He could survive in conditions that would have killed a baseline human being within hours. He was stronger by an order of magnitude. He was faster. He was, in the specific biological sense of the term, no longer entirely human. But this was the beginning of the transformation, not the end of it. The sand trout integration, over decades and centuries, proceeded toward the completion that the Fremen biology and the ecological literature described as the final stage of the sandworm life cycle, the worm itself. The sand trout that had integrated with Leto II's body were, on the timescale of their biology, moving through the transformation that turned the juvenile stage sand trout into the adult stage sandworm. Slowly, inexorably, over the 3,500 years of the God Emperor's reign, the transformation proceeded. What Leto II became over those millennia was something that the vocabulary of the Dune universe struggled to name. He was not a sandworm, not in the biological sense of a fully realized maker, the creature that the desert produced in its millions and that the Fremen rode. He was a hybrid, a collaboration, the result of a human consciousness surviving inside the biological transformation of the sand trout to worm cycle, rather than being consumed by it. He retained, somehow, against the biological logic that should have dissolved his individual identity into the worm's biology, his selfhood, his memories, his personality. The consciousness that had been Leto Atreides, the boy who had made the choice in the desert, persisting across 3,500 years of bodily transformation. This was the golden path, not a metaphor, not a philosophical orientation, a literal path through the probability space that required this specific act, this specific transformation, this specific endurance, because only from inside the biology of the worm, only from the specific vantage point of a consciousness that was simultaneously human and maker, could the intervention that the species required be made. The God Emperor's relationship with the sandworms of Arrakis was unlike anyone else's relationship with them, because he was one of them, or becoming one of them, or something in between, on a timescale that made the question of exactly what he was at any given moment genuinely difficult to answer. The sandworms that still moved through the desert, Arrakis had been partially greened by the God Emperor's management, but the deep desert remained, the worms continued, the spice cycle was maintained under conditions that Leto II controlled with the precision of someone who understood the ecology from the inside, were his kin in a sense that was not entirely metaphorical. He could communicate with them in ways that exceeded the make-a-hook negotiation that Fremen riders used, not through language in any ordinary sense, through the specific biological pathways of the worm's sensory and chemical communication system, which his hybrid body had access to in ways that no human being before him had accessed. The worms that approached the citadel, the ceremonial city of the god emperor's reign, moved differently than worms in the open desert. They were responsive to signals that Leto II generated, chemical, vibrational, electrical, that the ordinary worm ecology had no parallel for. The Fremen, who maintained their culture and their tradition in the sietches of the god emperor's Arrakis, were aware of this relationship and found it, characteristically, to be confirmation of the religious understanding they had always had. Shai Hulud was the god of the desert. The god emperor was the god of the Imperium. These two divinities were not separate things. In the Fremen theological framework, and the observation that they seemed to be in communication was not surprising to people who had always understood that the sacred and the ecological were expressions of the same reality. The Fremen were less certain what to make of the god emperor's management of the spice cycle and the ecology that produced it. They knew, with the accumulated knowledge of generations of intimate desert living, that the planet was different under Leto II's stewardship than it had been under Paul Muad'Dib's 12-year reign. The greening had proceeded in the north, in the polar regions, in the sheltered zones where the moisture was accumulating. The worms had retreated from those zones, as the ecology had always said they would when the desert conditions that the sand trout maintained were modified. And Leto II was managing this process, directing the terraforming in ways that preserved the deep desert while allowing the marginal zones to develop, holding the ecology in a configuration that maintained the spice production at levels sufficient for the Imperium's needs, while permitting the human quality of life on Arrakis to slowly improve. This management was itself a form of communication with the worm ecology. The choices about where to allow moisture to accumulate, where to permit the pioneer plants to establish themselves, where to hold the desert back and where to allow it to advance, these were choices that affected the worm's territory, the sand trout's function, the pre-spice chemistry of the substrate. Leto II made these choices from inside the biology rather than from outside it, which was why his management was more effective than any purely human administration of the planet could have been. The cost was everything that made him human. He had known this going in. He had seen it in the probability space and chosen it with the specific kind of acceptance that only comes from seeing no alternative. 3,500 years of the most complete solitude in the history of consciousness. The solitude of the last human being, in some sense, the creature that was between the human and the worm. That belonged fully to neither and had given up the capacity for belonging to one in order to belong partially to the other. He said in the texts that survived the God Emperor period that he missed the desert the way it used to be before he became part of it. That there was a quality to the desert's presence that he had known as a human being. The scale of it, the terror and beauty that the Fremen called the desert's voice, that was different when experienced from inside the ecology rather than alongside it. As a human being in the desert, you were in the presence of something vast and indifferent and ancient. As the God Emperor, you were the vast indifferent ancient thing, and the capacity for awe was no longer available to you, because awe requires distance between the one who is awed and the thing that awes, and that distance was gone. The death of the God Emperor was designed, not simply accepted, not simply the endpoint of a biological process that could not be indefinitely extended. Designed, engineered, planned across the full span of the 3,500-year reign with the specific purpose of achieving an outcome that required his death at a particular moment in a particular way. He died in the Idaho River. He fell from a bridge, or was pushed from a bridge, or fell in the specific way of a fall that was neither entirely accident nor entirely deliberate, but something in between, arranged so that the outcome was the one that the golden path required. He fell into the water, The water killed him in the way that water always killed sandworms, immediately, completely, through the specific biochemical incompatibility that the worm's biology had never developed a defense against, because the sand trout's ecology had been too successful for millions of years for the need for such a defense to arise. But the death was not simply death. As the God Emperor's body dissolved in the water, as the hybrid form that had been accumulating over 3 millennia broke apart in the biological dissolution that the water initiated, the sand trout that had been integrated into him separated back into the ecology, not as they had been before the integration. Transformed by 3,000 years of existence inside a human consciousness, carrying in their biology the trace of what they had been part of, the specific residue of Leto II's experience and memory and intention distributed through the biology of millions of juvenile worms. The Fremen tradition would come to call these the pearls of awareness. Not actual pearls, biological inclusions in the worm's neural tissue, distributed across the next generation and the generation after that, carrying in some form that the ecologists struggle to characterize the imprint of the consciousness they had been part of. Reverend mothers who performed the spice agony in the centuries after the God Emperor's death reported, in the deepest levels of other memory, something that was different from the ancestral voices they normally encountered, something older, stranger, less individualized, more like the memory of an ecology than the memory of a person. The sandworms that emerged from the generation of sand trout that had been part of Leto II were different from the worms that had preceded them. Not dramatically different. The Fremen who rode them in the Heretics period found them manageable in the same ways that worms had always been manageable, but subtly different in their responses, in the specific quality of their movements, in something that the Fremen riders described as an additional dimension to the negotiation that the Maker hooks allowed, as if the god were present more fully in some worms than in others, as if the 3,000-year experiment had left something in the biology that the riders could access, however imperfectly, however incompletely. This was not imagination. The biology was real. The transformation was real. The pearls of awareness were a genuine biological phenomenon, and their presence in the worm population had real consequences for the specific properties of the melange that those worms produced. The spice of the post-God Emperor era was subtly but measurably different from the pre-God Emperor spice, more complex in its chemical profile, with additional compounds that the pre-God Emperor literature had not described, with effects on prescient consciousness that the Bene Gesserit noticed and documented without fully understanding. The God Emperor had, in dying, changed the biology of the creature he had become. He had left himself in the ecology, distributed and diffuse and present in a way that the specific, individuated, temporally bounded existence of a single consciousness could not have been. He was in the spice. In some biological and metaphysically complicated sense, Leto II Atreides was in the spice that the sandworms produced for thousands of years after his death. The honoured matres burned Arrakis. This sentence needs to sit alone for a moment because what it describes is the most catastrophic single event in the history of the sandworm, not catastrophic in the sense of the worm experiencing catastrophe, since the worm did not have the kind of continuous selfhood that catastrophe could be experienced by, but catastrophic in the sense of an ecology being destroyed. The honoured matres, the women who had returned from the scattering, changed by whatever they had encountered in the uncharted dark beyond the Imperium's borders, carrying a violence that was partly learned and partly the psychological residue of having survived something terrible, used their obliterators on Arrakis. not on a military target, not on a specific installation or a specific defensive capability. On the planet, on the desert itself. The obliterators converted the surface of a planet to glass in the time it took for the sun to set. Not gradually, not in a way that left anything. The heat was sufficient to cause rapid evaporation of the subsurface moisture that the sand trout had been sealing for millions of years, a final release of everything the biology had been accumulating, vaporized and dispersed into an atmosphere that the glassing process had already begun to catastrophically alter. The sandworms died. Every sandworm on Arrakis died in the hours of the glassing. Not from the water, the evaporation was too rapid and too complete to pool on any surface that the worms could contact, but from the heat and the atmospheric disruption that destroyed the specific conditions the worm's biology required. The pre-spice masses in the substrate were incinerated. The sand trout were destroyed. The specific chemical environment that had supported the sandworm ecology for millions of years was eliminated in hours. The spice cycle that had been the foundation of the Imperium's economy for 10,000 years stopped. The glass plane of what had been Arrakis was the most complete destruction that the known universe had inflicted on a single ecology. Not the destruction of a species, there was one survivor, in a sense, the single sandworm that Sheena had been allowed to take from the planet before the glassing, the one specimen that the Bene Gesserit had managed to preserve aboard a no ship. Not the end of the possibility of the ecology, the sand trout that had been the juvenile stage of the life cycle. The biological machinery that made everything else possible existed in the preserved worm's biology as the next generation, waiting. But the destruction of an ecology that had been running continuously since before the first human being had set foot on any world anywhere. Shiena was the Fremen girl who could call worms. The phrasing understates what it was. The Fremen had been calling worms for millennia. The thumper was the tool, the maker hooks were the control mechanism, the sandwalk was the preparation. What Shiena could do was different. She walked out to the worms without tools. She stood in the open desert and the worms came to her, and came not as the threatening approach of something that needed to be managed, but as the presence of something that recognized her. This had not been seen before, or rather, it had been described in the Fremen religious tradition, in the specific stories of holy individuals who had stood before Shai Hulud without tools and been received rather than destroyed. These stories had been understood as allegory, as the theological language that religious traditions used to describe exceptional spiritual states. Shiena's experience was not allegorical. It was empirical, visible, documented by the Bene Gesserit observers who found her and took her to Chapter House. What made Sheena capable of this was not fully understood, even by the Bene Gesserit who were the best equipped to understand it. It was clearly related to the God Emperor's breeding program, to the specific genetic configuration that the 3,500 years of managed human genetics had produced in certain individuals. It was related to the pearls of awareness, to whatever the presence of the God Emperor's distributed consciousness in the worm biology meant for the worm's response to specific human beings. The worms that came to Sheena were responding to something in her biology that matched something in theirs. A chemical or electrical or more complex biological signal that the God Emperor's integration with the sand trout had seeded into both the human genetic pool and the worm's neural tissue. The Bene Gesserit took Sheena to Chapter House partly because she was extraordinary and partly because she was carrying something they needed. What they needed was the possibility of a new desert. What they needed was the ability to establish the sandworm ecology on a world that was not Arrakis, to restart the spice cycle, to ensure that the biological foundation of the Imperium's economy did not end with the glassing of the planet that had been its only source. On Chapter House, in the cold northern regions where the Bene Gesserit were already beginning the ecological modification that would create the desert conditions the sand trout required, the single surviving sandworm began the slow work of producing a new generation. The sand trout spread. The desert conditions spread with them, the moisture being sealed in the substrate as it had been sealed on Arrakis for millions of years, the aridity advancing as the sand trout population expanded. The ecology was restarting on a new world with the single specimen that the catastrophe had failed to destroy. It was slow. The timescales of the ecology were not human timescales, and the establishment of desert conditions sufficient for spice production on a temperate world was a process measured in decades for the initial phases and centuries for anything resembling the density that Arrakis had achieved. But it was happening. The biology was working. The desert was coming. And in the sandworm's biology, in the specific tissue that the ecologists had identified as the neural substrate of the pearls of awareness, something that was in some sense Leto II was still present, still distributed through the life cycle, still part of the spice that the ecology would eventually produce on this new world. The God Emperor, who had died in the Idaho River 3,500 years before the events of Chapter House, was in some form going to be in the spice of a world he had never seen. The biology carried what no other form of continuity could carry. Not memory in the human sense, not consciousness in any form that a reverend mother in the spice agony could have a conversation with, but a trace, a residue, a biological imprint that shaped the chemistry of the spice and, through the spice, shaped the consciousness of those who consumed it. This is what the biology of the sandworm had made possible. Not simply the spice and its effects, not simply the ecology and the desert and the Fremen and the Imperium. The specific form of continuity that the worm's biology allowed, not the immortality of a preserved consciousness, but the distributed persistence of a transformed one, carried in the chemistry of the thing that the worm produced and dispersed through the consciousness of everyone who consumed what the worm made. The No Ship carried worms. When Shiana and Duncan Idaho and the others left Chapter House on the ship, whose very existence was outside the perception of the prescient beings hunting it, they took worms with them. Not one this time, more than one, the ecology's minimal viable package, enough biology to begin the cycle on whatever world they eventually reached in the uncharted dark that the scattering had opened. This was not sentiment, not the collection of something precious for its own sake. It was the recognition that the sandworm was the foundation, not of the Imperium, which was ending, not of the political arrangements that had organized human civilization for 10,000 years, which were dissolving. The foundation of something more fundamental than politics or economy. The foundation of the specific consciousness expansion that the spice made possible. The specific perceptual range that the navigators accessed and the Reverend Mothers accessed and the prescient individuals of the breeding program accessed. The specific form of human capability that the universe's most consequential biology had made available to the species that stumbled onto the planet, that contained it. Wherever human beings went in the dark beyond the Imperium's edges, they carried with them the potential to develop new forms of that capability. They were already carrying Siona's genetic legacy, the invisible to prescience trait that the God Emperor had bred through the human population as the central mechanism of the Golden Path. But the spice provided the chemical activation for the capabilities the genetics made possible. Without the spice, the genetic potential was there, but the expression of it was limited. Without the spice, The prescient individuals who would navigate the uncharted future could not access the full depth of their faculty. The worms on the no ship were the insurance policy, the guarantee that somewhere, on some world, the biology would establish itself, the desert would form, the spice cycle would begin, and the human beings who found themselves in proximity to it would have access to the same chemistry that had been shaping human consciousness for 10,000 years on Arrakis. What those human beings would do with that access, what civilizations would form, what political arrangements would develop, what new forms of human capability might emerge when the spice that carried the God Emperor's biological imprint was consumed in quantities sufficient to open the deepest prescient depths of the new generation's consciousness was genuinely unknown. Not unknown in the way that the future was always unknown, as a probability space to be navigated, unknown in the specific way of the God Emperor's calculated unknowability, the result of the Golden Path's success in producing humans invisible to prescient sight, humans whose futures were genuinely open in a way that no previous human future had been open. The Sandworm was going into that unknowable future. The biology that had made the Imperium was now going to make something that the Imperium could not have imagined, on worlds that the Imperium had never mapped, in the company of human beings who could not be predicted by any prescient consciousness that might have tried to see them. What does it mean that the most consequential organism in the history of a galactic civilization was entirely indifferent to the civilization it shaped? The Sandworm did not know about the Imperium. It did not know about the Guild Navigators, or the Bene Gesserit, or the Spacing Guild's navigational monopoly, or the economic arrangements that made the spice the currency on which everything else was based. It did not know about the Fremen, despite being the center of their religious and cultural life, despite having been ridden by them for millennia, despite having been the source of the Crissac knife and the spice trance, and the specific quality of consciousness that the long spice saturation produced in the people who were born in its ecological presence. The Sandworm knew, if that word applies, if the worm's sensory and chemical and neurological apparatus can be said to know things in any sense that the word knows carries. The desert. It knew the chemical signals that indicated a spice blow. It knew the vibrational signatures of things moving in the sand, including the thumpers that the Fremen used to call it. It knew the specific discomfort that the exposure of its ring sections to air produced. It knew in whatever form biological organisms know the things that matter to their survival, the territory it moved through, and the ecology it was part of. Everything else, every consequence that flowed from its biology, every political arrangement and religious tradition and economic system and military campaign and scientific program that depended on the spice it produced was external to it, was the rest of the universe's response to the fact of its existence. The worm was not aware of being the foundation of anything. It was simply living, doing what it did, being what it was, in the desert that its biology and the biology of the sand trout had created and maintained. This indifference is not a flaw in the universe or a gap in the story. It is the point. The sandworm's indifference to the consequences of its biology is the most honest expression of what the Dune universe is exploring at its deepest level. The relationship between the ecological reality that actually governs the conditions of life and the human stories that are constructed on top of that ecological reality without genuine understanding of what sustains them. The Imperium was built on the Sandworm. The Imperium did not know it. The Imperium treated the desert as a resource extraction site, the spice as a commodity, the worm as a geological feature that happened to be biologically rather than mineralogically generative. The Fremen knew that the desert was Shai Hulud, and that Shai Hulud was sacred. But their theological understanding, profound as it was in its own way, was also not quite the thing itself. The worm was not the god the Fremen prayed to, any more than it was the geological feature the Imperium extracted. It was itself, the specific living organism shaped by millions of years of evolution, responding to the specific chemistry of its environment, producing the specific metabolic products that its biology produced. Entirely innocent of the stories that two very different human cultures had constructed around it. Pardot Kynes came closest to seeing it correctly, and even Kynes was primarily interested in what the ecology could be made to do, could be shaped into, could be managed toward, could be transformed into through the patient application of the terraforming program. The seeing of the thing itself, without the frame of what it could do or what it meant, was not something that the human beings who spent time with the sandworm generally achieved. It was too useful, too economically significant, too spiritually loaded for any of them to see it without those loads attached. Leto II, who had spent 3,000 years becoming part of it, may have come closest of all to understanding what it actually was. But by the time his understanding was most complete, he was no longer entirely the kind of consciousness that could communicate that understanding in the categories of human language, and the understanding may itself have been a different kind of understanding than the human kind, not propositional knowledge. Not the articulated comprehension that you could write down and transmit, but something more like the worm's own knowing, the biological familiarity of an organism with its environment. He is in the spice. Whatever understanding he achieved, whatever form of knowing developed from 3,000 years of being simultaneously human and worm, is in the spice. And every consciousness that the spice opens, every reverend mother, every navigator, every prescient individual who takes the melange deep enough to access what the melange has to offer, is, in some sense, in contact with it. The knowing is distributed through the biology the way the biology itself is distributed through the desert. The sandworm is not the villain of the story it inhabits. It is important to say this, because the surface reading of the sandworm's role, the giant creature that kills the unwary, that swallows the spice harvesters, that makes the desert lethal and requires the Fremen's extraordinary disciplines just to survive in its presence, could make the worm seem like an obstacle, a danger, a force that humanity had to learn to work around or master. This would be wrong. The sandworm is not the obstacle, it is the universe. It is the specific, actual ecological reality that the universe of Dune contains, around which everything else must orient itself or fail. The characters who understand this, the Kynes, father and son, who understood the ecology, the Fremen, who understood Shai Hulud as the divine, Paul, who learned from the Fremen to move in the desert rather than against it, Leto II, who took that understanding to its logical extreme. These are the characters who are capable of genuine agency in the story's world, because they are oriented toward what is actually there, rather than toward the story about what is there. The characters who don't understand this, the Harkonnens, for whom the worm was simply the inefficient delivery mechanism for the spice they wanted, the Imperium's administrators, for whom Arrakis was a resource extraction site with an exotic danger problem, the political actors who believed they could manage the spice as an economic lever without understanding the biology that produced it. These are the characters who consistently fail, who are consistently surprised by the desert's refusal to respond to their plans in the ways their plans expected. The worm's indifference is what makes this dynamic work. The worm cannot be appealed to, cannot be negotiated with, cannot be threatened or bribed or outwitted. It simply continues to be what it is, and everyone who tries to build something on Arrakis has to build it on the foundation of what the worm actually is, rather than what they would prefer it to be. The universe of Dune is, among other things, an argument for the primacy of ecology over politics, a sustained demonstration that the political stories humans tell about the world are always downstream of the ecological reality they are built on, and that the failure to understand this downstream relationship is one of the most dangerous forms of human blindness. The Sandworms' history is, in a sense, the history of what happens when a biological system is too successful at what it does. The sandworm and the sand trout created and maintained a desert. The desert was the specific ecological condition that the worm's biology required. The worm's biology produced the spice. The spice transformed the consciousness of the organisms that consumed it. The transformation of consciousness created the navigational capability of the Guild and the prescient depths of the Bene Gesserit and the Kwisatz Haderach and Paul Atreides, and eventually the God Emperor. The God Emperor's 3,000-year reign managed the entire known civilization of humanity from inside the biology of the thing that had started all of this. And in dying, the God Emperor released something into the ecology that changed the spice, and through the spice continued to affect the consciousness of every being who encountered it for centuries afterward. The sandworm did all of this without any of it being its purpose. It was pursuing its biology, which was to eat and to move and to produce the metabolic outputs of its digestive processes, and to continue existing in the desert that the sand trout maintained for it. Everything else, everything that the human story attached to this biology, was the consequence of that biology interacting with human consciousness. This is the sandworm's particular form of significance. It is not significant in the way that characters are significant through intention and choice and the arc of a personal story. It is significant in the way that physics is significant, as a fundamental fact of the universe that everything else has to accommodate. The sandworm is Arrakis' physics. Everything that happens on Arrakis happens in relation to the sandworm, constrained by the sandworm's existence and enabled by what the sandworm produces, and shaped by the desert that the sandworm needs. The human response to this fact, the range of responses, from the Fremen's theological engagement to the Imperium's exploitative extraction to Kynes' scientific love to Leto II's biological union, is the actual story of the Dune saga. But the sandworm is the story's ground. Remove the sandworm and there is no story, not because the characters disappear, but because the specific landscape of possibility that the characters inhabit, the ecology that makes some things possible and other things impossible, the chemical fact of the spice that elevates some human capabilities to extraordinary heights, the desert that makes the Fremen what they are, the biology that makes the God Emperor what he becomes, all of this is the sandworm's creation. The creatures that moved through the deep desert of Arrakis for millions of years before the first human being arrived were not aware of the story they were enabling. They were simply living, simply ancient, simply present in the desert they had made, doing what they had always done, producing what they had always produced, indifferent to the enormous weight of consequence that their biology was carrying. And that indifference, that complete, ancient biological indifference to the stories that built themselves on the foundation of the worm's existence, is, in the end, the most profound thing the sandworm has to teach. The desert does not care about the Imperium. The worm does not know about the spice's political significance. Shai Hulud does not read the prayers that the Fremen offer to it. The ecology is not listening to the arguments that the characters make about what it should do, or be, or produce. It simply is. And everything else must find its way in relation to that, there will be new worms. On Chapter House, in the first decades of the desert's spread across that temperate world, the sand trout were doing what sand trout had always done, sealing moisture, creating desert, maintaining the specific aridity that the next generation of makers required. The desert would take time. Decades for the initial desert conditions, centuries for the density of worm population that would produce significant spice. Millennia, perhaps, before a Chapter House desert fully resembled what Arrakis had been at the height of the God Emperor's reign. But it would come. The biology was patient in ways that human ambition was not. The ecology did not need to be hurried. It had its own timeline, its own logic, its own direction of travel that it moved toward with the same indifference it had always moved with. And in the no ship's cargo, in the carefully maintained desert conditions that the Bene Gesserit technicians were sustaining in transit, were more worms. Going somewhere new. Going into the dark that the honored matres had come from, into the space beyond the Imperium's maps, toward worlds that no prescient eye had surveyed and that the worm's biology was entirely indifferent to the nature of, as long as they offered the basic conditions that the sand trout could work with. The spice would flow again, not from Arrakis, Arrakis was glass, but from Chapter House, and eventually from whatever worlds the no-ship brought the worms to, and from those worlds' progeny, the worlds whose sietches would develop their own traditions around the ecology that arrived with the desert, that arrived with the sand trout, that arrived with the worms that Shiena had brought from the dying planet. The Fremen tradition would not survive intact to those new worlds. 15 centuries of God Emperor management and the subsequent disruptions of the Heretics period had already substantially changed what the Fremen were by the time Arrakis burned. The new desert people, whoever they eventually were, on whatever worlds the ecology established itself, would develop their own relationships with the worms in the context of their own histories, their own theologies, their own practical disciplines of survival in the desert that the worms would create around themselves. But the worms would be the same worms, not genetically identical to the ancient makers of Arrakis in every respect. The pearls of awareness had changed the biology, and the biology of any population changed over time with the selection pressures of its environment. But recognizably the same creatures, the same scale, and the same longevity, and the same indifference to the lives that would be built around their existence, the same deep, ancient, biologically committed fact of what they were. Shai Hulud, the old man of the desert, the maker, the source, the living geology of the desert worlds that the worm created wherever its biology was given room to work. Old before the Imperium, old before the Zensuni wanderers arrived on Arrakis and became the Fremen. Old before Pardot Kynes walked into the desert and understood what he was looking at. Old before Paul Muad'Dib rode his first worm and felt the specific quality of the god's motion beneath him. Old before Leto II let the sand trout cover his body and begin the transformation that would consume his humanity over 3 millennia. Old before the honored matres burned the planet, and Shiana carried the last specimen to a ship that would carry it somewhere new. And on the other side of that ship's journey, on whatever world received the desert, in whatever civilization grew up in the ecology the worms created, still old, still ancient, still doing what they had always done, producing what they had always produced, indifferent to the stories being told about them. The sandworm endures, not as a metaphor, as a biological fact. And that is finally the most important thing about it. The biology of the sandworm is stranger than the broad outline suggests, and the strangeness matters for understanding everything that follows. The sandworm had no eyes, This is the first remarkable thing about the sensory apparatus of an organism of this scale. The creature that could swallow a spice harvester was not navigating its environment visually. It had no need for visual perception in the complete darkness of the substrate that was its primary habitat. What it had instead was a sensory apparatus of extraordinary sensitivity calibrated to the specific signals that mattered for its survival and its ecology. Vibrational sensitivity so acute that it could detect the regular rhythm of a walking human at considerable distance through hundreds of meters of sand. Chemical sensitivity sufficient to detect the specific compounds associated with spice. Blooms and biological targets at similar distances through the same substrate, and something that the scientists who studied it described in the technical literature as an electromagnetic sensitivity of uncertain mechanism that appeared to allow the worm to respond to signals that no purely mechanical or chemical explanation fully accounted for. The vibrational sensitivity was the property that had shaped the most practically important aspects of the Fremen's desert adaptation. The sandwalk, the irregular, arrhythmic gait that Fremen learned from childhood, and that Paul Atreides spent weeks developing to the level of reliability that the open desert demanded, was a direct response to the worm's vibrational detection. Regular rhythmic movement was the signal the worm tracked. The sandwalk was the disruption of that signal, the deliberate injection of arrhythmia into a person's locomotion to make the vibrational pattern resemble the wind-driven movement of sand rather than the purposeful movement of a food-sized organism. The ecological logic of the worm's vibrational sensitivity was clear. The substrate was full of organisms that moved in characteristic patterns, and the worm's sensory apparatus had been shaped over evolutionary time to distinguish between the patterns that indicated prey and the patterns that indicated geological noise. The Fremen, who had been living alongside the worm for long enough to learn this distinction thoroughly, had turned the worm's sensory logic into the basis of their desert survival discipline. The thumper was the same logic from the other direction. Rather than disrupting the pattern the worm tracked, it amplified it, generated the specific regular vibrational signature that the worm's sensory apparatus was most sensitively tuned to, creating a signal that the worm responded to with the directness of an organism responding to a stimulus it had spent millions of years learning to respond to. The chemical sensitivity was more complex and less completely understood. The specific compounds that the worm responded to in a spice blow were related to the compounds in the pre-spice mass, but the relationship was not simply that the worm was smelling food. The worm's response to the spice blow had characteristics of territorial behavior as much as feeding behavior. It approached the blow with a directness and a specificity that suggested the chemical signal was functioning as something more like a location marker than a prey indicator. The worm was not hunting the spice blow the way a predator hunted prey. It was responding to the spice blow the way an organism responded to a signal about its own territory or its own biological resources. This territorial character of the worm's spice bloom response was part of what made the spice harvesting operations of the Harkonnen period and the early Atreides period so genuinely dangerous. The worms came to spice blows not because they were hungry, but because the chemical signal was imperative, not a signal that could be habituated to, not a signal the worm had any evolved tendency to ignore, but the most fundamental kind of biological signal, the one that commanded the organism's movement with something more like instinct than choice. The worms that arrived at spice blows were not attacking the harvesting operations. They were not even aware of the harvesting operations in any meaningful cognitive sense. They were responding to the chemical signal, and the harvesting operations happened to be occupying the space the chemical signal was directing them toward. The harvesters were in the way, and the worms responded to them being in the way any organism responded to an obstacle between itself and the most fundamental biological imperative of its existence, by removing them. This distinction between the worm attacking and the worm simply not having a category for the difference between a spice harvester and a large rock in its path was important for understanding the Fremen's relationship with the creature they called their god. Shai Hulud was not dangerous in the way a predator was dangerous, choosing to attack, pursuing prey with intelligence and intent. Shai Hulud was dangerous the way an ocean was dangerous, not through malice, not through awareness of the individual human being caught in the waves, but through the simple fact of being an enormously powerful physical force operating according to its own logic that human beings had to respect or be destroyed. The Fremen's theology encoded this understanding accurately. The worm was divine, not because it was wise in the human sense, not because it had intentions toward the Fremen, not because it heard their prayers and responded to them. It was divine because it was the overwhelming fact of the universe they inhabited, the thing they had to orient themselves in relation to or fail to survive. The divinity was not about the worm's inner life. It was about the worm's outer fact. The sandworm's digestive biology was the mechanism through which the spice cycle operated, and understanding it requires following the chemistry from one end to the other. The worm consumed, was consuming, at any given moment of its existence, the organic material of the substrate through which it moved. Not selectively, not hunting specific prey. Moving through the sand with its great mouth open, filtering the substrate for the biological matter that its digestive system could process, consuming in vast quantities the microbial communities that lived in the sand and the more complex organisms that the desert ecosystem supported. The digestive process operated at high temperature. The worm's body chemistry ran hot, not hot relative to the desert surface temperature, which could reach lethal extremes, but hot relative to the substrate temperature at depth where the worm spent most of its existence. The specific enzymes involved in sandworm digestion required temperatures that would be fatal to most terrestrial organisms. And the metabolic rate that maintained those temperatures was itself one of the factors that required the worm to consume continuously. It was, metabolically speaking, one of the most energetically demanding organisms that any known ecology had produced. The outputs of this digestion, the metabolic byproducts, the excretions, the compounds produced by a biological system of this size and temperature and metabolic intensity, were distributed through the substrate wherever the worm traveled. Over millions of years of worm movement through the same general territory, the substrate chemistry had been profoundly modified by the accumulated metabolic outputs of innumerable generations of worms. The mineral composition of Arrakian sand, the specific chemical profile of the substrate at different depths, the particular combination of organic and inorganic compounds that the desert soil contained, all of this bore the imprint of millions of years of worm metabolism. The pre-spice mass was the most concentrated and chemically interesting of these metabolic outputs. It formed at specific depths under specific temperature conditions when the specific mineral environment of the Arrakian substrate interacted with specific compounds the worm's metabolism produced. The formation process was slow. The pre-spice mass accumulated over extended periods before reaching the concentration and temperature threshold that triggered the blow. And once that threshold was reached, the chemistry of the blow was itself complex, not simply the exhalation of the accumulated pre-spice material, but a reactive process in which the specific compounds of the pre-spice mass interacted with atmospheric oxygen in the moment of eruption to produce the specific chemical profile that melange actually had. This was why the spice that was recovered from a blow was different from spice that was extracted from the substrate before eruption. The atmospheric chemistry that occurred in the blow was part of what made melange. The same compounds, extracted from the substrate without the blow chemistry, did not have the same biological properties. The specific oxygen-mediated reactions that occurred in the blow produced compounds that the subsurface chemistry alone did not produce, and it was these compounds that were primarily responsible for the consciousness-altering properties of the spice. The Fremen understood this empirically, long before anyone had analyzed it chemically. They knew that the spice from a blow was the potent spice, that the most concentrated and medicinally significant melange was recovered from the blow itself rather than from digging in the substrate around a blow site. They had not articulated the chemistry, but they had observed the outcome consistently enough across generations that the understanding was encoded in their practices, in the specific ways they recovered spice and the specific value they placed on the different qualities of what they recovered. The question of sandworm intelligence, whether the worm thought in any sense of the word that the word could meaningfully apply to an organism of its nature, was one that the biologists debated without resolution, and the Fremen had already answered, in their own way, without framing it as a question. The Fremen answer was simple. Shai Hulud was not intelligent in the human sense, but was also not merely an animal. The god occupied a different category, not intelligent, not unintelligent, but ancient. Old in a way that made intelligence and its absence both feel like inadequate descriptions. The god's knowing was the desert's knowing, which was different from the knowing that human beings did, and not less than it. The scientific answer was more tentative and more specific. The worm's neural organization was distributed rather than centralized. It did not have a brain in the sense of a concentrated neural processing center, but instead a diffuse nervous system spread through the ring segments of its body, coordinating movement and sensory responses through a network that processed information in parallel across the organism's length. This distributed architecture was capable of remarkably complex behavioral responses. The way the worm managed the extraction of its ring sections in response to the maker hooks was not a simple reflex, but involved the coordination of multiple segments worth of nervous tissue to produce a directed rotational response. The worm was not simply reacting. It was doing something that required the integration of sensory input from multiple sites and the coordination of motor output from multiple sites into a coherent directional behavior. But this complexity of response did not obviously constitute intelligence in the way the word was used for organisms with centralized neural processing and the capacity for genuine learning. The worm did not appear to learn from individual experience in the way that organisms with memory consolidation in a central neural structure learned. It responded to the chemical and vibrational signals of its environment with characteristic patterns that had been shaped by evolution, not by individual experience. The worm that was ridden by a Fremen for the 100th time was not a worm that had learned from the previous 99 experiences. It was a worm that was responding to the same signals with the same evolved patterns. The exceptional cases, the worms that came to Shiana, the worms that were associated with the pearls of awareness in the post-God Emperor period, the behaviors described in the Fremen oral tradition for exceptionally old individuals of the species, these suggested that something more complex might be possible at the extremes, that the distributed neural architecture might, in specimens that had been accumulating neural complexity for centuries, develop emergent properties that the baseline biology did not exhibit. But documenting this was almost impossible. The oldest worms were the ones in the deepest desert, the ones farthest from any human observation, the ones that had been avoiding the signals of human presence for the longest time. The data on the behaviors of the very old individuals was almost entirely anecdotal, filtered through the Fremen's theological interpretation, impossible to subject to the kind of controlled observation that would have been necessary to make scientific claims. The god emperor, who had spent centuries becoming part of the worm's biology, never claimed that the worms were intelligent in the human sense. He claimed something stranger, that what the worm knew, it knew completely, in the way of organisms for which knowing and being were the same act. The worm knew the desert the way the desert knew itself, not as a proposition about the desert, but as the direct experience of being the desert, of being the thing that the desert was built around, of existing in a relationship with the substrate and the chemistry and the biology of Arrakis that was not subject to object knowing, but something more like the object knowing itself. This was not philosophy in his framing, it was biology. The worm's distributed neural system, integrated with the substrate chemistry through which it continuously moved, responsive to signals that were the desert's own chemical and vibrational language, this system had a form of knowing that was real and specific and complete within its domain. It just was not the kind of knowing that human categories had been built to describe. The pre-Fremen history of the sandworm, the millions of years of its existence before any human being arrived on Arrakis, is recoverable only in fragments and implications, through the geological record and the biological logic of what must have been true to produce what was actually observed. The earliest sandworms were not the enormous creatures of the Atreides period. Evolution is an optimization process, and the optimization of an organism toward a particular ecological niche takes time. The biological logic of the sandworm's current form, the scale, the temperature, the metabolic rate, the distributed nervous system, the specific chemistry of the spice producing digestive processes, was the product of millions of years of selection pressure in the specific ecological context of Arrakis. What drove the selection toward large scale was the efficiency of substrate processing at large body size. A larger organism could process more substrate per unit of surface area, could maintain the higher metabolic temperature of the digestive chemistry across a larger volume, could move through the substrate more efficiently relative to the energy cost of movement, could accumulate the biological reserves necessary to survive the periods of poor substrate quality that any heterogeneous environment produced. Larger was better. In the specific ecological niche the ancestral sandworm occupied, and the selection pressure toward larger scale had operated consistently enough, for long enough, to produce the extraordinary organisms of the Arrakeen deep desert. The longevity was a consequence of the same selective logic. An organism that had invested the metabolic cost of growing to very large size had a corresponding benefit from living long enough to fully exploit that size advantage. The costs of large scale were primarily upfront, the metabolic investment of growth, and the benefits were ongoing. An organism that grew to 100-meter scale and then died after a few years had paid the growth cost without collecting the full benefit. The selection pressure was toward longevity. Live long. Keep growing. Keep processing substrate. Keep producing the metabolic outputs that the ecology downstream of the worm depended on. The result was individual organisms that were, by the time they reached full biological maturity, literally older than human civilization. The largest sandworms of the Atreides period, the great ancients of the deep desert, the ones that the Fremen called the Old Ones and spoke of with a quality of reverence that was different from the reverence they gave even to ordinary Shai Hulud, had been alive continuously since before the first records of human presence on Arrakis. They had been alive before the first Zensuni refugees arrived. They had been alive before the guild's navigational monopoly had been established. They had been alive before the Padishah Imperium had been founded. They had seen, not seen in the absence of eyes, but existed through the entire span of human history on Arrakis. From outside, from the depth of the substrate, from the specific biological perspective of an organism that had been doing the same thing in the same place for longer than any human institution had existed. What the Fremen tradition said about these great ancients was that they carried the memory of the desert in a way that no human being or human institution could carry anything. Not the specific memories of events and faces and words, but the memory of the desert's quality, the specific texture of its existence across centuries and millennia of what the desert actually was. The great ancients were, in the Fremen understanding, the closest thing to the desert's own consciousness. The organisms that had been in continuous contact with the desert for so long that the distinction between the worm knowing the desert and the desert knowing itself had dissolved. Paul Atreides' relationship with the sandworm evolved across the arc of his time on Arrakis in ways that reflected the evolution of his understanding of the planet and the ecology. The first worm he ever saw was at the spice harvesting operation that Liet Kynes brought him to observe shortly after the Atreides' arrival on Arrakis. He watched the harvester extraction in progress, watched the carriole positioning overhead, and then watched the worm sign, the subtle shift in the sand's surface that indicated the approach of something enormous from below. He watched the emergency extraction proceed, watched the carriole lift the harvester clear of the surface, watched the ground crew scrambling for the pickup, and some of them not making it in time. And then he watched the worm emerge. The accounts of this moment consistently note the scale. The emergence of a worm at even middling size was an event of sufficient physical scale to constitute what the Fremen called a maker event, a moment at which the god was directly present in the visible world rather than implied by the desert's chemistry and the substrate's vibration. The creature that came out of the sand was not large in the way that large buildings were large. It was large in the way that geography was large, in a way that made the categories of object that human beings normally applied to things of significant size feel completely inadequate. Paul watched it, not with the fear that the crew members who had not been evacuated in time presumably felt, with a focused, almost analytical attention that the prescient faculty was developing in him as the spice saturation increased. The attention that did not filter experience through the emotional categories of approach and avoidance, but simply received it as information, as the reality of what was there. What he received was the fact of the worm as a fact of the desert, not an obstacle. Not a danger, exactly, though it was certainly that. A presence. The most concrete possible expression of what Arrakis was beneath the political surface. The most direct evidence available that the desert was not simply a context for human activity, but a system with its own reality that human activity had to navigate on the system's terms. Kynes, who was watching Paul watch the worm, registered something in the observation that he was not expecting. He would later describe it in the private writings that survived his death in the desert as the response of someone who had already learned to look at the worm the right way, who was looking at it not as a thing to be overcome or a danger to be managed, but as the fact that it was. He thought, watching Paul watch the worm, that he might be dealing with something more than he had been asked to assess. The first ride changed the quality of Paul's relationship with the worm from observation to engagement. The difference is significant in the way that the difference between watching an ocean and swimming in it is significant. Both are encounters with the same reality. but the quality of information and the nature of the encounter are categorically different. Paul, on the back of the worm, was inside the ecology rather than adjacent to it. The speed, the vibration transmitted through the body, the specific weight of the hookwork required to maintain direction, the reading of the worm's rotational responses, the wind and the sand and the desert at speed. All of this was information that could not be transmitted by description or observation. It had to be lived. He described, in the accounts preserved in the historical record, the worm's motion as something between swimming and flight, a movement through the substrate that was not constrained by the surface topology the way terrestrial movement was constrained, that flowed through the resistance of the sand rather than over it. That could not be mapped onto the categories of movement that Kaladin had taught him. The Fremen had a vocabulary for the qualities of worm motion, the slow erg drift versus the fast charge, versus the deep sand course, versus the surface skimming that the worm adopted when pursuing spice signals. And Paul learned this vocabulary not through instruction, but through the direct experience of being on the worm when it moved through each of these modes. The worms remembered nothing of the individual rides. This was clear enough from the Fremen tradition, which described each worm call as a fresh encounter, each mounting as a new negotiation, each ride as requiring the same full attention and the same complete skill, regardless of how many times you had ridden this specific worm before. The worm was not habituating to human riders. It was not developing a tolerance for the hook pressure or a familiarity with the specific vibrational signature of a known rider. Each encounter was, for the worm, new, because the worm's neural architecture did not consolidate individual experiences in the way that permitted the learning we associate with intelligence. This meant that the relationship between a Fremen rider and any particular worm was entirely one-sided. The rider accumulated experience, developed skill, learned the specific characteristics of particular worms, their typical size, their typical speed, their typical responsiveness to specific hook positions. The worm accumulated nothing. The relationship was not mutual in the sense of the worm having a relationship. It was the Fremen's relationship with a fact of their world, one that required skill and attention and genuine capability to navigate, but that offered nothing back in the way of recognition or responsiveness to accumulated history. This asymmetry was central to the specific quality of the Fremen's theological relationship with Shai Hulud. The god did not know you. The god was not watching you. The god was not evaluating your prayers or responding to your piety or rewarding your faithfulness with protection. The god simply was, in the desert that was the god's domain, and your relationship with the god was entirely your own, a relationship you maintained with something that had no awareness of maintaining a relationship with you. This is the theology of genuine extremity rather than comfort theology. Comfort theology needs the god to know you, to care about you, to be responsive to your individual existence. The Fremen didn't have room for that kind of god. The desert was too honest. The worm too specifically factually indifferent to whether you lived or died. The theology had to be built on what was actually there, and what was actually there was a god that was real, that was powerful beyond any human measure, that was entirely worthy of worship and reverence and the specific forms of awe that the Fremen's tradition developed for it. And that did not, would not, could not care about any individual Fremen the way that a loving deity in the comforting tradition cared about its followers. What the god offered, in the Fremen understanding, was not personal relationship, but the opportunity for participation. You could be part of what the god was doing, you could exist inside the ecology, move through the desert in the specific ways that the desert's logic required, contribute your body's water to the desert's water cycle when you died, ride the god's back when the occasion required and the skill permitted. participation was the religious life. Not being known by the god, but knowing the god from within. The Bene Gesserit's interest in the sandworm was simultaneously more and less than it appeared. On the surface, the sisterhood's interest in the sandworm was the same as everyone else's interest in the sandworm. The spice. The spice agony, the ordeal through which Reverend Mothers were created, required the water of life, the exhalation of a drowned sandworm, the specific biological fluid produced in the worm's respiratory tract when the worm was submerged. Transformed by the Reverend Mother's biology from a lethal poison into the specific substance that opened other memory, the sisterhood needed the water of life, and the water of life came from the sandworm, and therefore the sisterhood needed the sandworm to continue to exist and to continue to be drown-able at the specific moments when the spice agony needed to be performed. But beneath this practical dependency was something more interesting. The Bene Gesserit had been watching the sandworm from a distance through the Missionaria Protectiva's knowledge of the Fremen tradition, through whatever scientific contacts the sisterhood maintained on Arrakis, through the other memory of Reverend Mothers who had lived on or near Arrakis and who had encoded their observations in the ancestral chain that all Reverend Mothers could access. For long enough to have developed a picture of the sandworm that was more complete than the Imperium's administrative records suggested. They knew that the sandworm was the source not just of the spice, but of the specific kind of consciousness expansion that the spice enabled. They knew, or strongly suspected, that the specific biological pathway from worm to spice to prescient consciousness was not simply a matter of neurochemistry. That there was something about the specific compounds the worm produced that went beyond the pharmacological effects of a consciousness-altering substance and touched something more fundamental about the relationship between biological chemistry and the kind of perception that Reverend Mothers and guild navigators and prescient individuals operated in. The breeding program was, in part, about this. The Kwisatz Haderach, the super-prescient individual that the sisterhood had been working toward for 90 generations, was not simply someone who happened to have the right genetics combined with the right spice consumption. The Kwisatz Haderach was someone whose genetics were specifically suited to a particular kind of interaction with the worm's biological outputs. Someone whose nervous system was configured to respond to the specific compounds in the melange in ways that baseline human nervous systems did not respond. Someone who would be able to access the full depth of what the worm's biology had to offer to human consciousness. The sandworm, in other words, was not just the source of a useful drug. It was the source of a biological signal, encoded in the chemistry of its metabolic outputs, that interacted with human consciousness in ways that were not fully understood, but that the Bene Gesserit had been trying to systematically exploit across their entire history. The spice was the interface between the worm's biology and human biology. The Reverend Mothers, with their other memory, and the navigators, with their prescient navigation, and Paul Atreides, with his fully opened prescient faculty, all of these were different expressions of the same interface, different degrees of access to whatever the worm's biology was making available to human consciousness. The water of life was the most concentrated expression of this interface, the most potent form in which the worm's biology could directly engage with human consciousness. The transformation from the drowned worm's exhalation to the substance that the Reverend Mother then transmitted to the Sietch community, the specific conversion that only a biological system with the Bene Gesserit training could perform, was in some sense the most direct possible collaboration between the human nervous system and the worm's biology. The Reverend Mother was, in that moment, doing something in her body that the sandworm's biology was on the other side of, converting between the worm's chemical language and the human body's chemical language, making available to human consciousness what the worm's biology had encoded in the exhalation. This perspective, the sandworm as the biological system encoding information in its metabolic outputs that human consciousness could access through the spice, is not contradicted by the scientific facts, but is a different framing of them than the pharmacological one. And it matters for understanding the pearls of awareness, because the pearls were, in this framing, not simply a trace of Leto II's consciousness persisting in the worm's biology. They were an addition to the information that the worm's biology was already encoding, a new kind of signal added to the spice, a new layer of what human consciousness could access when it opened to the worm's metabolic outputs. The relationship between the sandworm and the desert was not simply that the worm required the desert. The worm made the desert through the specific ecology that the sand trout maintained and that the worm sustained by sustaining the sand trout. The desert made the worm through the specific conditions that the worm's biology required and that the desert's chemistry and temperature provided. The relationship was circular in the way of all mature ecologies, not a relationship between cause and effect, but between two elements of the same system that could not exist without each other. This circularity was what Pardot Kynes understood and what the Imperium's administrators consistently failed to understand. The Harkonnens wanted to maximize spice production. Maximizing spice production required maximizing the conditions under which the worm could operate, which meant maximizing desert conditions, which meant supporting the sand trout's water sealing function, which meant actively working against the introduction of moisture into the desert ecosystem. The Harkonnens did none of this, not deliberately, because they did not understand what they were managing. They managed the spice harvest, the surface event, the blow, and the recovery without understanding the biology that produced the blow or the ecology that sustained the biology. The result, over 80 years of Harkonnen management, was a slight long-term decline in spice production in some areas of Arrakis. A decline so slow as to be detectable only through careful statistical analysis of the harvest records, but real and attributable to the specific ways in which the Harkonnen operations were inadvertently modifying the ecological conditions that sustained the worm population. Not catastrophically, the worm ecology was robust enough that 80 years of imperfect management did not seriously threaten it. But measurably. The Kynes terraforming program was doing something more radical and more understood, deliberately introducing moisture into the desert ecosystem in controlled ways, with explicit knowledge of what this would do to the sand trout's water sealing function and therefore to the desert conditions that the worm required, with the intention of producing a marginal zone of livable desert without destroying the deep desert that the worm depended on. The program worked in the Children of Dune period more successfully than even Pardot Kynes had projected, and the success created the crisis that it created. The competition between the terraforming's advancing moisture and the worm's retreating territory, because a program built on understanding an ecology was still subject to the ecology's own dynamics. Leto II's resolution of this crisis was the most extreme possible intervention in the ecology that had ever been attempted. He did not resolve the competition between the terraforming and the worm by choosing one or the other. He resolved it by becoming part of the worm and from inside the worm's biology managing the ecology with a precision that no external management could have achieved. He kept the deep desert. He kept the worm. He maintained the conditions for spice production, and he allowed the terraforming to continue in the marginal zones, because the marginal zones served purposes: human habitation, human quality of life that the Golden Path required him to preserve as motivations for the Fremen and for the billions of people who lived in the shadow of his imperium. He was, in this period, the desert. Not metaphorically. The specific biological system that maintained the ecology was partly him, or he was part of it, and the ecology's behavior under his management reflected the fact that its central organism had been integrated with a human consciousness rather than simply being itself. The desert of the God Emperor's reign was a managed desert, and the management was invisible because it came from inside the biology rather than from outside it. After the God Emperor's death, the desert experienced something that had not happened in the entire span of the Sandworms' evolutionary history. Unmanagement. For 3,500 years, the ecology had been held in a specific configuration by the God Emperor's conscious management of its conditions. The sand trout had been directed through whatever biological mechanisms the God Emperor's hybrid form could access to maintain desert conditions in specific areas and to allow moisture accumulation in others. The worm population had been managed implicitly through the management of its habitat. The spice production had been maintained at specific levels through the same indirect management. When Leto II dissolved in the Idaho River, all of that ended. The ecology was released back into its own dynamics. What happened next was the ecological process that Paul Atreides had always described as the long-term equilibrium. The desert and the moisture zones, released from management, would find their own new configuration based on the relative strength of the two biological systems. The sand trout's water sealing function in the deep desert versus the moisture accumulation in the northern and marginal zones. Without the management that had been holding this balance, the systems would compete until they reached a new equilibrium. In the 1500 years between Leto II's death and the events of Heretics of Dune, the desert of Arrakis reconstituted itself in the deep desert while the marginal zones remained. The worm population, which had been maintained at managed levels under the God Emperor's stewardship, expanded back toward what the deep desert's conditions could support. The spice production increased in the deep desert zones where the ecology was most fully reconstituted. The Fremen, who had maintained their culture in the Sietches during the God Emperor's reign, found the desert returning to something more like what their tradition described and less like the managed environment they had actually inhabited. The worms of the Heretics period were different from the worms of the Paul Atreides period in the specific ways that 1500 years of the God Emperor's managed ecology had produced. Smaller, on average, the ecology in its managed form had not allowed the very largest specimens to develop, because the God Emperor's management of the territory had affected the conditions under which the oldest individuals could exist. But genetically and neurologically carrying the pearls of awareness, carrying whatever had been distributed through the worm population in the generations since the God Emperor's death, carrying him in the specific way that biology carries what has been inside it. The last worm seen alive on Arrakis, the one that Shiena had been observed calling, the one that the Bene Gesserit had come to Arrakis partly to investigate, the one that was eventually taken from the planet before the Honored Matres destroyed it, was in some sense a different organism from all the worms that had preceded it. Not genetically different in ways that could have been measured from the outside. Not behaviorally different in ways that the ordinary worm-riding tradition would have noticed, but internally different in the specific ways that the pearl-bearing neural tissue made an individual worm different from the pre-God Emperor worms, carrying in its biology the distributed residue of a consciousness that had been the most complete synthesis of human and worm that had ever existed. that had thought across 3,000 years in the specific form of thinking that the hybrid biology permitted. Sheena's relationship with this worm was, if the Bene Gesserit analysis was right, not simply the relationship between a human being with unusual biological sensitivity and an ordinary sandworm. It was a relationship between a specific human genetic configuration, one that the God Emperor's breeding program had been working toward, without the Fremen tradition fully understanding that they were the material through which a selective program was operating, and a worm that carried in its neural tissue the biological imprint of the consciousness that had created that genetic configuration. The worm knew her, in some sense, not in the cognitive sense of recognition and memory, but in the biological sense of the specific compounds that her body chemistry produced, interacting with the specific compounds that the worm's neural tissue produced in a way that created the response she observed. The worm came to her because its chemistry and her chemistry were in correspondence, because the God Emperor's 3,000-year integration of human and worm biology had left traces in both, and those traces resonated across the biological distance between them. The God Emperor had in some sense prepared the ecology for Shiana. Not specifically, he had not planned for Sheena in particular, could not have planned for a specific individual 15 centuries after his death. But the genetic program he had been running had been working toward the production of individuals with this specific biological signature, and the transformation he had undergone had left the specific biological imprint in the worm ecology that those individuals' biology would resonate with. The pieces had been placed long before anyone knew the shape of the puzzle they were intended to fit. The sandworms that the No ship carried into the unknown represented something unprecedented in the history of the organism. Sandworms leaving Arrakis, or leaving Arrakis, which was what remained of Arrakis by the time of the glassing. And even that, leaving Chapter House, where the ecology was still in its first centuries of establishment on the New World. In the millions of years of the sandworm's evolutionary history, the organism had been entirely Arrakis-specific. Not because it couldn't exist on other worlds, the ecology had demonstrated its capacity to establish itself on Chapter House, but because there had been nothing to carry it. The sandworm did not produce the kind of dispersal structures that allowed organisms to spread between worlds under their own biology. It was not capable of surviving in space. It was entirely dependent on mechanisms outside its own biology to leave the planet it had evolved on. The Fremen and then the Bene Gesserit had provided those mechanisms. First Shiana, taking a single specimen from Arrakis. Then the Chapter House ecology, establishing itself from that single specimen. Then the No ship, carrying specimens from Chapter House into the uncharted dark. The worms on the No ship were not aware of this history. They could not have been aware of it. Their biology did not support the kind of temporal consciousness that awareness of history required. They were simply organisms, existing in the desert conditions that the ship's technicians maintained for them, consuming the substrate, producing the metabolic outputs that their biology produced, doing what they had always done in the specific biological way they had always done it. But they were going somewhere new. The specific desert world that would eventually receive them, the specific ecological context in which their biology would establish itself, the specific population of human beings who would live in the spice-rich environment and be changed by it, these were genuinely unknown. Unknown in the specific way that the Golden Path had made things genuinely unknown, outside the reach of any prescient faculty, genuinely open in a way that the God Emperor's 3,000-year management had been working to create, and the scattering had begun to realize. The sandworm was going into the genuinely open future, into the space where prescient sight could not reach, into the territory of what would actually happen rather than what could be predicted to happen. And there, wherever there turned out to be, the ecology would establish itself. The sand trout would begin their work, the desert would advance, the spice would eventually blow, and whoever lived long enough in that desert environment would be changed by it, their eyes going blue, their perception expanding, their consciousness touching something that the worm's biology was always offering to whatever human consciousness was willing to be shaped by the desert long enough to receive it. The god was going with them, not Shai Hulud as the Fremen had known the god, not the specific ancient individuals of the Arrakis deep desert, not the creatures that Stilgar had ridden and that Paul had directed with maker hooks across the sand sea at the battle for Arrakis. Those worms were gone. Arrakis was glass. But the god in the sense that mattered, the biology, the ecology, the specific chemistry of the worm's metabolic outputs, the possibility of consciousness expansion that the spice represented, the pearls of awareness distributed through the worm's neural tissue, whatever of Leto II remained in the biology that had been him, all of this was alive, maintained in the no ship's cargo, going somewhere new. The makers would make new deserts. The new deserts would make new Fremen, or something like Fremen, people shaped by the ecology, adapted to its demands, carrying its specific chemical signature in their blood and their eyes, and the spice would flow from those new deserts and open the consciousness of those new people to whatever the worm's biology encoded and to whatever trace of 3,000 years of human worm synthesis the pearls of awareness carried. The history of the sandworm, all of it, from the earliest evolutionary ancestors to the millions of years of Arrakis deep desert existence, to the ecological partnerships with the Fremen, to the biological merger with Leto II, to the glassing of Arrakis, to the preservation on Chapter House, to the voyage on the no ship, was not ending. It was beginning a new phase. A phase whose specific character could not be predicted, could not be seen in the probability space that prescient sight mapped, could not be planned for in any detail by any consciousness that remained within the reach of the existing systems. It was going somewhere genuinely new. And the worm, ancient and indifferent and biologically committed to the specific things that worms did, was going with it. The history of the sandworm is the history of what happens when a biological system becomes, by the sheer fact of its existence and its products, the most consequential thing in the universe it inhabits. Not by design, not through intention, not through any form of agency in the human sense, by being exactly what it was in the specific place it occupied, producing the specific outputs that its biology had evolved to produce for long enough that the consequences accumulated beyond any single entity's ability to contain or comprehend them. The Imperium was built on it. The Guild's navigational monopoly was built on it. The Bene Gesserit's power was built on it. The Fremen's civilization, their religion, their military excellence, their ecological dream, their specific form of human excellence, all of it was built on the fact of the sandworm's existence and the biology it practiced in the desert it had made. Paul Atreides' prescience was built on it. Leto II's transformation was an expression of it. The Golden Path, the most ambitious and most costly thing a human consciousness had ever attempted. 3,500 years of managed tyranny in service of a future the tyrant would not live to see, was a direct response to what the sandworm's biology had made possible by making Paul Atreides possible. And the sandworm was not aware of any of it, was never aware of any of it. The most consequential organism in human history moved through the sand of its desert, consuming substrate, producing spice, occasionally carrying human beings on its back in a negotiation it would never understand was happening, and was entirely, completely, in the most fundamental biological sense, innocent of consequence. This innocence is the deepest thing about the sandworm. Not its size, not its age, not its destructive capacity, or its ecological centrality, or the extraordinary chemistry of its metabolic outputs. The innocence, the complete biological innocence of an organism that had shaped the destiny of a civilization simply by existing and doing what its biology required. The desert has no opinion about what is built on it. The worm has no opinion about the spice. Shai Hulud does not know about the Imperium. And yet, no Imperium without Shai Hulud. No prescience without the spice. No spice without the worm. No worm without the desert. No desert without the sand trout. And so it goes, the chain of ecological dependency that runs from the most grandiose human political ambition all the way back to a juvenile organism the size of a human hand sealing moisture in the sand of an ancient desert world. The sandworm was not the point of the story. It was the foundation of the story. The story was what human beings built on that foundation. What they made of the biological fact that their universe contained this organism, and that the organism's biology happened to produce the most consequential substance in the known universe. The foundation did not care about the story. The foundation simply was. Ancient, complete, indifferent to consequence. Enduring, the water of life was not water. This is the first thing to understand about it. The name was Fremen, carried the specific weight of the Fremen's relationship with water as the most sacred substance in existence, gestured at the paradox that the most toxic liquid they knew was named after the most precious. But it was not water in any chemical or biological sense. It was something the sandworm's body produced in the specific circumstances of drowning. The biological fluid of the worm's respiratory and metabolic systems forced into a composition it did not normally take because the worm's biology was responding to the specific stress of submersion in the water that would kill it. When a sandworm was drowned, a process that required effort and planning and the specific knowledge that a worm was going to die and that its death would produce the substance you needed, the physiological response to the flooding of the worm's respiratory system produced a cascade of chemical reactions that generated compounds not normally present in the worm's body fluids. The stress of dying activated biological pathways that were dormant in the living worm, produced compounds that were functional in the context of the dying worm's emergency response systems and catastrophically toxic in the context of any other biological system that encountered them. The resulting fluid, the water of life, in the Fremen tradition, the exhalation of the dying worm, the most lethal substance in the known universe, contained these emergency compounds in concentrations that made it immediately fatal to any organism that consumed it without the specific biological capability to convert it. The conversion required the Bene Gesserit technique, a specific form of biological control applied at the cellular level. That could take the most toxic of the fluid's compounds and modify their chemistry in ways that changed them from cell destroyers to something the body could process, and that, in processing, had extraordinary effects on the nervous system and on the psychological architecture of whatever consciousness had been present during the conversion. This transformation was the spice agony. The Reverend Mother who underwent it was a woman who consumed something that should have killed her, and through the specific discipline of her training, converted it in her own body into something else. The conversion was not simply chemical, it was experiential. The consciousness that was present during the conversion was changed by the process. opened, in the specific way of opening a locked door, to the ancestral memory that the Bene Gesserit tradition accessed. Other memory became available. The female ancestral line, stretching back through the generations to the earliest human beings whose genetic descendants had eventually included this specific woman, became accessible as experiential memory rather than simply as genetic inheritance. The worm had done this. The worm's dying biology, combined with the human body's specific capacity for the chemical conversion, had created the conditions for this particular form of consciousness expansion. It was not a simple drug effect, not the pharmacological interaction between a compound and a receptor system. It was more complex, the interaction between the worm's biological emergency chemistry and the human body's biological emergency response, in the specific context of a consciousness that had been trained to navigate the emergency rather than simply surviving it. The Fremen Sayadinas, who underwent this ordeal in the desert tradition, who drank the water of life without the formal Bene Gesserit training that gave it some degree of manageability, were engaging with the worm's death chemistry in a context that was genuinely life-threatening. Most survived because they had been selected for specific biological characteristics that made the conversion more achievable. Because the Fremen's long-term spice saturation had modified their biology in ways that reduced the toxicity threshold, and because the Fremen tradition had accumulated across generations the specific practical knowledge of how to support someone through the ordeal. But the ordeal was real, and the risk was real, and the transformation, when it was successful, was as genuine as the risk. Jessica's ordeal in the Sietch, performed while pregnant with Elia, without having undergone the spice agony before in any setting. She had the training, the Bene Gesserit techniques, but not the prior experience of the conversion itself, was the most dangerous version of the water of life ordeal. That it succeeded, and that it produced not only a Reverend Mother but the preborn Elia who would carry other memory from before birth, was evidence both of Jessica's extraordinary capability and of what the worm's biology could do when it encountered the right human system. Paul's ordeal, when he drank the water of life in the desert and spent 3 weeks in a coma that the Fremen tradition would have said no male had ever survived, was a different kind of evidence entirely. The male biology was not equipped for the water of life conversion in the way that female biology was. The specific endocrine system, the specific neural architecture, the specific pathways that made the Bene Gesserit training achievable for women, these were not present in the same configuration in male biology, and the history of the ordeal, going back through the Fremen tradition and beyond into the pre-Fremen awareness of what happened when men tried to access these depths, was a history of death. Paul survived it because he was the Kwisatz Haderach, because his genetics, the product of 90 generations of Bene Gesserit selection pressure, had produced in him the configuration that allowed a male biology to do what only female biology should have been able to do. The conversion happened. The other memory opened. Not just the female line that female Reverend Mothers accessed, but the male line as well. The dark places in the ancestral record. The territory that Reverend Mothers had always navigated around rather than through. The accumulated weight of the male history of violence and dominance and the will to power in its most direct form. Paul went through. He emerged with a prescient faculty fully open, with access to the full probability space of the future, with a vision of the jihad in its complete, devastating detail. He emerged from the worm's dying biology, having become the thing the Bene Gesserit had been working toward across 90 generations of deliberate breeding. The Kwisatz Haderach arrived a generation early, outside their management, outside their control. The water of life had made Paul Muad'Dib, not the weirding way, Not the desert training, not the prescient dreams that had preceded the worm's death chemistry. The water of life, the sandworm's dying biology, interacting with the most specific and complete version of the human genetic project that the Bene Gesserit had ever produced, had completed the transformation that made Paul into the figure whose existence would reshape the known universe. The worm had died for this. Not intentionally. The worm died because it had been drowned, because someone had planned the drowning, because the substance the drowning produced was needed for a purpose the dying worm was entirely unaware of. But the transformation was real, and the substance was real, and the specific chemistry of the dying worm's body was the direct cause of what Paul became. This is the most intimate connection between the sandworm and the human story that the Dune saga describes. Not the worm as transportation, not the worm as the source of the spice, not the worm as the Fremen's deity. The worm as the direct biological cause of the most consequential transformation in human history. Its dying body, the chemistry that opened the Kwisatz Haderach. There is a specific quality to what the oldest worms of the deep Arrakis desert had that the younger ones lacked, and the Fremen tradition gave it a name without fully explaining what it was: the quality of being a great maker. The great makers were the ones whose rides Fremen spoke of with a specific reverence that distinguished extraordinary experiences from merely excellent ones. Not simply larger than ordinary worms, though they were larger, the scale of very old specimens being so far beyond what the younger individuals reached that the comparison barely worked. Not simply faster, though they moved with a quality of purpose that riders described as different from the purposeful movement of younger worms, as if the ancient body had learned through centuries of movement. A specific efficiency that the younger biology was still working toward. The quality that the Fremen pointed at was something more like presence. The great makers were present in the desert in a way that the younger worms were not, present not in the cognitive sense of being aware of the desert and its contents, but in the physical sense of being so thoroughly part of the desert that riding them was different from riding a worm that was younger and smaller. The desert responded to the great makers differently. The sand moved differently around them. The specific chemistry of their passage through the substrate was more concentrated, more complex. The pre-spice deposits they left in their wake richer and more varied than what the younger biology produced. The Fremen tracker tradition had, over generations, developed ways of identifying the territory of the great makers, the specific patterns of sand deposition and substrate chemistry and dune configuration that indicated an ancient individual's regular passage. These territories were treated with the respect that Fremen gave to areas where the god's presence was most concentrated, most directly expressed in the physical world. Camping within a great maker's territory was something the tradition cautioned against. Not because the great maker was more dangerous than other worms, it was, if anything, slower to respond to vibrational signals because of the specific neural characteristics of the very old distributed system, but because the desert around it was more sacred, more charged with whatever quality the Fremen's theological vocabulary described as Shai Hulud's direct presence. The greatest riders, the Fremen who had achieved the kind of desert mastery that the tradition honored above ordinary excellence, had ridden the great makers. Not necessarily by choice. The thumper called what it called. And sometimes what it called was one of the ancient individuals whose territory you had unknowingly encroached on. But those who had ridden the great makers and returned described the experience as categorically different from ordinary worm riding. The speed, the quality of the movement, the specific character of the directional response to the hook pressure, the sensation, described consistently in accounts across different riders and different time periods. Of being in contact with something that was old enough to be in some biological sense, beyond the ordinary. Paul may have ridden one in the period of the Desert War. The Fremen tradition offers no reliable accounting of which individual riders encountered which individual worms, and the deep desert records of the guerrilla years are fragmentary. But what the oral tradition preserves in the accounts of Paul's riding during the years before the battle is a consistent quality that the most experienced Fremen riders around him described as different from what they expected. Something about the scale of the encounters, the distances covered, the specific way the worms responded to his direction that suggested either exceptional luck or the sustained attention of individuals whose territory his thumpers had reached at unusual depths. Whether he ever rode a true great maker is not something the record confirms, but the Fremen who rode beside him in the Desert War said that the worms that answered his calls moved as if they had been expecting the call for longer than a thumper's range should account for. The tradition noted this without explaining it. The sandworm's relationship with Arrakis' larger ecology, the organisms that had co-evolved with it over millions of years, the plants and animals and microorganisms that had built their lives in relation to the worm's existence and the desert its biology maintained, was one of the most completely analysed ecologies in the imperial scientific literature. Largely because Liet Kynes had spent his life developing the analysis and transmitting it to anyone capable of using it. The desert vegetation was, overwhelmingly, adapted to the extreme aridity of the sand trout-maintained desert, which meant it was adapted to conditions of water scarcity that would be fatal to plants evolved for any other environment. But there were edge zones, the rocky outcroppings and the sheltered cliffs, and the polar margins where the sand trout's water sealing function was less complete, where different plant communities had established themselves, communities that were adapted to the margins rather than the deep desert. These edge zone plants were the foundation of Kynes' terraforming vision. They were already there, already adapted to Arrakis, already capable of survival in conditions that water-world plants could not manage. The terraforming program was not the introduction of alien species to a hostile environment. It was the systematic expansion of what was already present at the margins of the desert, pushing the edge zone plants outward, creating the conditions at the margins where more complex plant communities could establish themselves, building the ecological ladder that would eventually produce the mixed moisture ecosystem that Kynes had projected as the long-term outcome of the program. The animals that lived in the deep desert were the most completely adapted of all the non-worm organisms on Arrakis. The sand mouse, the kangaroo mouse, the muad'Dib of the Fremen name that Paul had taken for himself, was the mammal that had gone furthest in the adaptation to worm ecology desert. Its physiology was specific to the demands: concentrated urine to minimize water loss, long back legs optimized for the leaping movement that was most efficient in sand, the ability to remain motionless for extended periods in ways that reduced metabolic water expenditure, and the specific biological relationship with the desert's chemistry that allowed its body to tolerate the low-level spice exposure that everything living in the worm ecology environment experienced. The muad'Dib was the animal that Paul had chosen as his desert name. The Fremen tradition's use of the creature as a name for someone who fit the desert perfectly, who survived where others could not, who had adapted to what the desert required with a completeness that transcended technique and became genuine belonging, said everything about what the animal represented in the ecology's framework. The sandmouse was not the most impressive animal in the desert by any conventional measure. It was small. It was prey for the larger hunters that the deep desert supported, but it was perfectly suited to what the desert was in a way that the larger and more obviously impressive creatures were not, and the Fremen's theological imagination had placed this specific form of perfect suitability next to the image of the god on the face of the second moon. Muad'Dib and Shai Hulud, the small perfect thing and the vast ancient thing, both in the desert, both belonging to the desert, the one perfectly adapted to living in the ecology that the other created. This was the Fremen cosmology in image form, and Paul had stepped into both sides of it. He had taken the desert mouse as his public name, and he had drunk the water of the dying worm and let the dying worm's biology transform him into what the worm's biology could transform the right human being into. He was Muad'Dib in name and Shai Hulud's specific creation in biochemistry. The sandworm and the deep nature of time, the god emperor who had more experience of the sandworm's relationship with time than any other consciousness in history, who had been inside the sandworm's biology, experiencing time through a hybrid architecture that was partly human and partly worm, described the worm's experience of time in terms that were difficult to translate into the categories of human temporal consciousness. The worm's distributed neural architecture did not consolidate memory in the way that centralized neural processing consolidated memory. Each moment of the worm's experience was, in some sense, present to it, not as a sequential narrative of past leading to present, leading to anticipated future, which was how human consciousness organized time, but as a continuous field of current state. The worm was not, in Leto II's description, experiencing time as a sequence. It was experiencing time as a presence, the complete state of the ecology it was embedded in, moment to moment, without the before and after that narrative consciousness imposed on the stream of experience. This was not simply the absence of memory in the human sense. It was a different relationship with time entirely, one that the worm's biology had developed because it was appropriate to the specific ecological role the worm occupied, an organism that needed to navigate the long-term dynamics of a desert ecology, that needed to respond to the slow cycles of spice bloom chemistry and substrate temperature and the movements of other worms through the same territory, did not need narrative memory of specific events. It needed sensitivity to current states, to the continuous present of the ecology it was part of. The result, Leto II suggested, was that the worm was more completely present in each moment than any narrative conscious human being could be. The human consciousness was always partly in the remembered past and partly in the anticipated future. Narrative structure was temporal structure, and temporal structure meant that the present was always being framed in relation to what was before and after it. The worm had no before and after in the narrative sense. It had only the current state of the ecology experienced directly without the framing. Whether this constituted a form of awareness superior to human awareness, or simply a different form of awareness appropriate to a different kind of organism, was a question Leto II was careful not to answer definitively. He had experienced both, the human consciousness he had started with and the worm's relationship with time that he had developed as the integration proceeded. He was not willing to say that the worm's temporal experience was better. He was willing to say it was real and complete within its own terms, and very different from the humankind. The pearls of awareness in this framing were the most improbable possible thing. The introduction of human narrative consciousness, human temporal structure, human before and after experience, into the ecology of an organism whose biology was organized around the complete absence of narrative. The worm's biology, post-God emperor, carried in its neural tissue the trace of a consciousness that had organized its experience in the human way, that had maintained a narrative self across 3,000 years of biological transformation. And this trace was in an organism whose own biology was organized around the complete opposite of narrative consciousness. What the Reverend Mothers reported experiencing in the depths of the spice agony in the post-God Emperor period was not quite the voice of Leto II. Not the specific, individual, temporally located voice of a person. Something more distributed than that, more ecological than that, a quality in the depth of the other memory that felt less like a person speaking and more like the memory of having been inside something that was not quite a person. The quality of the worm's temporal experience, accessed through the human narrative framework of other memory as mediated by a biology that had been both. This was the most complex thing that the sandworm's biology had ever produced, not the spice, not the prescience, not even the Kwisatz Haderach, a form of knowing that was simultaneously the worm's way and the human way, that could not have been produced by either biology alone, that existed in the neural tissue of every worm born since the God Emperor's death, and was accessible through the spice to every consciousness that went deep enough into the melange to find it. The sandworm is not finished. This is the last thing to say about it, and it is the most important. But before reaching the end, there is one more thread to trace: the relationship between the sandworm and Paul Atreides in the final days of his reign, because this relationship illuminates something that the mythology around Muad'Dib consistently obscures. Paul was blind when he walked into the desert. The stone burner, a weapon of the conspiracy against his rule deployed in Arrakis, had taken his physical sight. He retained his prescient faculty, which meant he could navigate the world through the probability space his vision showed him, rather than through his eyes. But the faculty and the eyes were different forms of perception, and the loss of the eyes changed his relationship with the world in ways that the intact faculty did not compensate for. What the eyes gave him was the present in its immediate, specific, irreproducible quality. The prescient faculty gave him probabilities, patterns, the broad shapes of what was likely to come. The eyes gave him the singular fact of what was actually here, now, in this specific moment. Chani's face, the color of the desert at a particular angle of light, the specific grain of Arrakis' sand, rust, orange and ancient, holding the entire history of the worm's biology in every particle. The eyes gave him the now that the prescience could not give him, because the prescience was organized around the future rather than the present. Without the eyes, the present became less immediate and the future became more. He was more prescient in a sense than before, more thoroughly in the probability space, less anchored to the specific facts of the moment. And this change in his perceptual balance made the desert walk, when he chose it, a different act than it would have been for a sighted person following the same tradition. The Fremen tradition of the blind man's desert walk was clear when a person could no longer perform the sand walk with the reliability that open desert required, when the risk of drawing the worm through irregular movement became greater than the individual's ability to manage it. The tradition said to walk into the desert and give yourself back to it. The tradition was about the body and its capabilities. A blind man whose Bene Gesserit training gave him extraordinary body control might still be capable of the sandwalk, might in fact be more capable of the complete arrhythmia that the sandwalk required than a sighted person whose eyes provided constant feedback on terrain that the sandwalk then had to work around. Paul knew this. He chose the desert walk not because his body could no longer perform what the desert demanded, but because his prescient faculty had shown him that continuing to govern was doing more harm than good, that the jihad he had unleashed was consuming the universe in ways that his continued presence was sustaining rather than ending, that the desert walk was the one act available to him that genuinely freed the probability space from his influence rather than continuing to organize it around him. He walked into the desert that the sandworm had made. He walked into the domain of Shai Hulud, the god that his name had been attached to in the Fremen tradition for years, the creature whose dying biology had transformed him into what he had become. He walked in using the specific gait that the worm's vibrational sensitivity had shaped across generations of Fremen adaptation, the sandwalk that the worm's existence had made necessary and that the Fremen tradition had perfected over centuries of practice. He was not found. The Fremen tradition held that this meant the desert had received him, that the god who could not be fooled by ordinary human attempts to exist in its domain had accepted his return, had taken him back as one of its own, rather than swallowing him the way it swallowed everything else. The Fremen's theological interpretation was their own. The biological reality was simpler, a skilled practitioner of the sandwalk with Bene Gesserit body control that exceeded most Fremen riders' capability, navigating the desert through a prescient faculty rather than through visual perception, could survive in the open desert indefinitely without the encounters that killed less prepared people. Whether Paul Atreides lived on, somewhere in the deep desert, walking the worm's domain and following the probability space toward whatever outcome it showed him, was worth walking toward. This is not something the historical record resolves. The Fremen said he was out there. The prescient consciousness cannot be entirely unaware of what it is doing in the specific way that a non-prescient person might stumble into the desert and die. If he chose to live, the capability existed. If he chose to die, the desert was patient enough to wait. What is certain is that the desert received him. The sand was still there, and the worms were still in it. And the specific ancient indifference of the ecology that had shaped him was unchanged by his presence or his absence. Muad'Dib walked into the domain of Shai Hulud, and Shai Hulud, ancient and complete and entirely innocent of the mythology that had attached to both of them, moved through the substrate of the same desert it had always moved through, doing what it had always done. The human story and the worm's biology, in the end running alongside each other in the same desert, neither aware of the other's full significance, both part of the same world. Every ecological story has an end. The end of the ecology, the collapse of the system, the extinction of the keystone organism that everything else was built around. The sandworm's story has had its most dramatic near ending. Arrakis burning, the ecology destroyed on the planet where it had evolved and operated for millions of years, the worm reduced to a handful of specimens preserved by the specific combination of Shienya's extraordinary biological relationship with the creature and the Bene Gesserit's institutional foresight. But near ending is not ending. The biology persists. On Chapter House, in the first centuries of the New Desert's establishment, the ecology is restarting from its basic elements, the sand trout spreading through the substrate, the aridity advancing, the pre-spice chemistry beginning to accumulate in the substrate of a world that has never before contained it. The timescales are geological rather than political. The spice production will not reach the density that Arrakis achieved in any human lifetime, or several human lifetimes, but the direction is set and the biology is determined, and the ecology that the sand trout and the worm maintain together has been restarting from small beginnings before. On the evidence of the geological record, the Arrakeen ecology itself had passed through bottlenecks, had been reduced to small founder populations by events in the distant past, had recovered and expanded and reached the extraordinary density of the Atreides period from previous collapses. The biology knows how to do this. The organisms do not need to understand the project to execute it. The sand trout seal the moisture. The worm, as it grows to full scale, produces the metabolic outputs that the substrate requires. The pre-spice mass accumulates. The blow happens. The spice disperses. The human beings in proximity are changed. And somewhere in the dark beyond the maps, on worlds that have never been surveyed and that no prescient sight has reached, the worms that the no-ship carries are going to be introduced to new substrates, new atmospheric chemistries, new geological contexts. The biology will adapt. The sand trout's water sealing function will respond to the specific chemistry of the new substrate and develop the specific variations in its function that the new substrate requires. The worm will grow into the new environment, developing the specific adaptations that its evolutionary history makes it capable of developing in response to new selection pressures. The worms of the new worlds will be different from the worms of Arrakis. Not unrecognizably different, the fundamental biology is conserved across all the variation that evolutionary time produces, but specifically adapted to specific contexts, developing the specific expressions of the biology that the specific environments they inhabit require. And those new expressions will produce new variations of the spice. Not the same melange that Arrakis produced, the same fundamental compounds, the same basic pharmacological profile, but modulated by the specific atmospheric and geological chemistry of the new worlds in ways that will produce novel interactions with the human consciousness exposed to them. The consciousness expansion that the spice enables will take new forms, develop new capabilities, access depths that the Arrakeen spice had never touched. Because the chemical context was different, this is the ultimate consequence of the no-ship's departure. Not simply the preservation of the sandworm, but the distribution of the biological system that produced the most consequential substance in the history of human civilization across worlds that substance will encounter for the first time. The consciousness, expanding chemistry that the worm's biology has been producing for millions of years will meet human nervous systems that have been shaped by entirely different selection pressures on worlds with entirely different histories, in circumstances that the ecology of Arrakis could not have prepared either the worms or the humans for. What will emerge from that meeting is genuinely unknown. The prescient sight that might once have described probable outcomes of this distributed biological experiment cannot reach into the territory where Siona's genetic legacy and the scattering have placed the humans who will encounter the new spice. The outcomes will be genuinely open in a way that nothing in the documented history of the sandworm has been genuinely open before. The sandworm, which has been making the spice that shaped human consciousness for millions of years, is going to encounter human consciousness that it has never shaped before. And that encounter, that specific biological meeting between the ancient worm ecology and the genuinely new human contexts, is the chapter that this history cannot write, because it has not happened yet. It is coming. The biology is in transit. The desert will form wherever the sand trout are carried, because that is what the sand trout do. The worm will grow, because that is what the worm does. The spice will blow, because that is what the spice does. And the human beings who find themselves in the new desert will be changed, because the chemistry of the dying worm's world is the chemistry that changes human beings, and the world it creates and maintains is the world that shapes the people who live in it into something they could not have become without it. The history of the sandworm is not a story with an ending. It is a story in which an ending has been reached and a new beginning is already underway. The ancient organism, moving through the substrate of a new world, does not know that it is beginning again. It is simply doing what it has always done, being what it has always been, producing what its biology has always produced. The universe is not finished with the sandworm. The sandworm is not finished with the universe. The desert comes with the worm. The desert always comes. And in the desert, everywhere the desert spreads, the god is. Old before the first human being looked at the first grain of sand and felt the first stirring of the specific awe that the desert produces in the consciousness capable of it. Old before the name Shai Hulud. Old before the Fremen. Old before the Imperium and the Guild and the Bene Gesserit and everything else that the spice made possible and the worm sustained. Old and going forward, into the new desert, the new world, the new consciousness waiting to be opened by the chemistry of the ancient biology making its way through whatever substrate receives it. The maker makes. The desert endures. The spice flows. And somewhere, in the dark between the stars, on a ship whose location no prescient eye can fix, the old ones sleep in the cold and wait for the substrate they will make their own.